The first time anyone saw Eli Mercer's body, he was 12 years old and bleeding onto the oil-stained concrete of a biker garage in the middle of a January storm. His foster father's fists had finally gone too far. The men standing around him, scarred, tattooed, and dangerous, weren't supposed to care about broken kids. They were outlaws, criminals, some said, the kind of men decent people crossed the street to avoid. But when Graves, the club's sergeant-at-arms with 3 combat tours and eyes like frozen steel, knelt down beside that dying boy, something shifted in the cold Montana air. Because sometimes the most dangerous men in town are the only ones willing to stand between a child and the monsters wearing respectable masks. Before we ride into this storm together, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. This story gets darker before it gets better, and I need to know you're ready to see it through to the end. The Black Vultures MC Clubhouse sat 3 miles outside Ashford, Montana, where the highway bent around frozen pine forests and the wind cut through clothing like broken glass. It wasn't much to look at. A converted mechanic's garage with wooden siding that had weathered to gray, a gravel parking lot scarred by tire tracks, and a neon Coors Light sign that flickered in the front window like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the smell of motor oil mixed with cigarette smoke and old coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate since dawn. Eli Mercer had been watching the place for 3 weeks before he finally walked through the front door. He'd learned the patterns. The bikers arrived around noon most days, their Harleys growling through the cold like mechanical wolves. They worked in the garage behind the main building, restoring bikes and drinking beer from bottles they kept in an ancient refrigerator that hummed louder than the space heaters. Sometimes they sat around a wooden table playing cards until the early hours, their voices low and rough like gravel under tires. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, Eli saw them look at each other in a way that reminded him of soldiers in the war movies his mother used to watch before she disappeared. He'd been living with Wade Garrison for 7 months when he decided the bikers were his last option. The foster house on Oak Street had seemed fine at first. Social services had sold it to him like a fresh start. A real bedroom, regular meals, a chance to attend school without changing districts again. Wade had smiled during the placement interview, his hands folded neatly on the kitchen table, his voice warm and concerned. The caseworker had smiled back. Nobody had checked the basement. Nobody had asked why the previous 3 foster kids had all requested emergency transfers within 6 months, and nobody had noticed the way Wade's smile disappeared the moment the caseworker's car pulled away from the curb. The first beating came 2 days later. Eli had forgotten to take out the trash. It was a small thing, an easy mistake for a kid still learning the house rules. But Wade's backhand had caught him across the mouth hard enough to split his lip, and when Eli stumbled backward into the kitchen counter, Wade's boot had found his ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this before. "You live under my roof. You follow my rules," Wade had said, his voice flat and cold. "We clear?" Eli had nodded, tasting blood. He was 11 years old. He had nowhere else to go. The beatings became routine. A wrong word at dinner, dishes left in the sink too long, breathing too loudly when Wade was watching television. The reasons didn't matter. Wade didn't need reasons. He needed control, and Eli was the only thing in his life he could control completely. The bruises accumulated like a map of survival, purple and yellow continents across Eli's ribs, his shoulders, the backs of his thighs where teachers wouldn't see during the casual wellness checks at school. Eli learned to move quietly, to make himself small, to read the warning signs in Wade's posture and the smell of whiskey that usually preceded the worst nights. He stopped talking in class, stopped making friends, stopped hoping that anyone would notice the way he flinched when adults raised their voices or moved too quickly. Because he'd learned something important during his 11 years being shuffled through the foster system. Nobody was coming to save him. The caseworkers were overworked and overwhelmed. The teachers had 30 other students to worry about. And the other kids, even the kind ones, knew better than to get involved with someone marked as troubled. So Eli had started watching the bikers instead. He'd discovered the clubhouse by accident one afternoon when he'd taken the long route home to avoid Wade's truck in the driveway. The sound of engines had drawn him off the main road, and he'd stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot watching men in leather cuts work on motorcycles with the kind of focus Eli had only seen in mechanics who actually loved what they did. One of them, a huge man with a gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, had looked up and caught Eli staring. "You lost, kid?" Eli had shaken his head and run, but he'd come back the next day. And the day after that, watching from the tree line, trying to understand what he was seeing. These men were supposed to be dangerous. Everyone in Ashford said so. The MC had a reputation: fights, drugs, run-ins with law enforcement that never quite stuck. Respectable people didn't associate with the Black Vultures. Parents told their children to stay away. But Eli had seen something else during those weeks of watching. He'd seen the gray-bearded biker, Mac, the others called him, stop his work to help a younger member fix a carburetor, his voice patient and instructive. He'd seen them share food from the diner across the highway, passing containers around the table like family. And once, he'd seen a man in a leather cut with sergeant-at-arms stitched across the back help an elderly woman change a flat tire in the parking lot, refusing payment, his movements efficient and careful. These men were violent, maybe, dangerous, certainly, but they had rules, structure, and from what Eli could tell, they protected their own with a loyalty that looked almost religious in its intensity. So on a Tuesday afternoon in January, with fresh bruises hidden under his collar and 2 cracked ribs that made breathing feel like swallowing glass, Eli pushed open the clubhouse door and walked inside. The conversation died immediately. 7 bikers sat around the wooden table, cards frozen in their hands, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Behind the bar, an older woman with bleached hair and sharp eyes stopped pouring whiskey mid-glass. In the corner, someone had paused a game of pool, the crack of balls silenced. Outside, the winter wind howled against the windows, and somewhere deeper in the building, a space heater rattled like old bones. Eli stood beneath the flickering Coors Light sign and tried to remember how to breathe without crying. The man at the head of the table moved first. He was older than the others, somewhere in his 50s maybe, with gray threading through dark hair, cut military short, and a face carved from hard angles and old scars. His leather cut was worn soft with age, the patches faded but carefully maintained. Graves, his name patch read, Sergeant-at-Arms. He didn't stand, didn't smile, just studied Eli with eyes the color of January ice, the kind of eyes that had seen things civilians couldn't imagine and survived by learning to read danger in shadows. "Clubhouse is members only," Graves said, his voice quiet and rough like boots on gravel. "You lost?" "Numb." Eli shook his head. His throat felt too tight to speak. He'd practiced this moment 100 times in his head, but now that he was actually standing here surrounded by dangerous men and the smell of leather and motor oil, all his carefully rehearsed words dissolved into panic. One of the younger bikers, maybe 30, with prison tattoos crawling up his neck, laughed. Kid wandered in off the street, probably looking for his daddy. "Shut it, Cole," Graves said without looking away from Eli. The laughter died. Eli forced words through the tightness in his chest. "I can work." Silence. Someone shifted in their chair. Outside, a crow called through the winter storm. "Work," Graves repeated slowly like he was testing the weight of the word. "In the garage," Eli said, his voice steadier now. "I've been watching. I know you restore bikes. I can sweep, clean tools. Whatever you need. I'm good at organizing, and I don't eat much." The woman behind the bar made a soft sound in her throat. Mac, the gray-bearded mechanic, leaned back in his chair. "Kid, how old are you?" 12. "Where's your parents?" "Foster house, Oak Street." Something shifted in the room. The bikers exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. Eli saw recognition pass between them, the kind of silent communication that came from years riding together, bleeding together, learning each other's demons. Graves stood slowly. He was shorter than Mac, but moved with the controlled precision of someone who'd been trained to kill efficiently. He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped close enough that Eli had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "Take off your jacket." Eli's heart hammered against his cracked ribs. "What?" "Your jacket. Take it off." Jim's boy. Eli's hand shook as he unzipped the thin coat. Too small. Meant for a younger kid. Another hand-me-down from the donation bin at social services. The room was warm from the space heaters, but he felt suddenly, violently cold. Graves looked at the bruises visible through Eli's t-shirt, the purple and yellow continent spreading across his collarbone, the defensive marks on his forearms, the careful way Eli held himself to protect his damaged ribs. When Graves spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more dangerous. "Who did this?" Eli said nothing. He'd learned that lesson early. Talking about Wade only made things worse. Caseworkers asked questions and then sent him back to the same house with a man who now knew he'd been telling stories. Teachers expressed concern and then moved on to students with problems they could actually solve. The system protected itself, not kids like Eli. "Your foster father?" Graves asked. Eli looked at the floor. His silence was answer enough. The sergeant-at-arms studied him for another moment, then looked over his shoulder at Mac. "He can sweep the garage 3 afternoons a week. Pay him cash." Mac nodded slowly. "You sure?" "No," Graves said, "but we're doing it anyway." Cole, the young biker with the neck tattoos, leaned forward. "Boss, we ain't running a charity." Then consider it an investment in community relations." Graves cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Kid needs work. We got work. Problem solved." He turned back to Eli. "You come here after school, do what Mac tells you. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. You steal from us. You lie to us. You bring trouble to this door. We're done. Understood?" Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. "And one more thing." Graves leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You ever need help? Real help? You come straight here. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it yourself. You hear me?" Something in Eli's chest cracked open. Not hope, exactly. He didn't know if he still believed in hope, but maybe something close. Something like the possibility that the world might contain people who would stand between him and the things that wanted to hurt him. "Yes, sir," he managed. Graves straightened. "Mac, get him something to eat before he puts him to work. Kid looks like he hasn't had a decent meal in weeks." The woman behind the bar, Tina, Eli would learn later, who owned the diner across the highway and kept the clubhouse stocked with coffee and common sense, was already pulling sandwich fixings from the refrigerator. She built him something massive: turkey, cheese, lettuce, tomato, mustard, layered between thick slices of bread that looked homemade. Eli sat at the bar and ate like a soldier, expecting the mess hall to close any second. The bikers went back to their card game, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silence felt different now, protective, almost, like they'd decided something about him without needing to discuss it out loud. When he finished eating, Mac led him to the garage. The workspace was organized chaos. Tools hanging from pegboards, motorcycle parts arranged on metal shelving, a concrete floor stained with decades of oil and history. 3 bikes in various states of restoration sat on lifts, their engines exposed like mechanical hearts waiting for surgery. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like dying insects, and the smell of gasoline mixed with metal and grease created a scent that Eli would later associate with safety. "Start with sweeping," Mac said, handing him a broom. "Work your way from the back corner forward. Don't touch anything you don't recognize. Some of these parts cost more than your foster father makes in a month." Eli nodded and got to work. He swept with the same intensity he brought to everything else, desperate focus, as if by controlling this small task he could impose order on the chaos of his life. He swept around the bikes, under the workbenches, into corners that probably hadn't been touched in years. When he finished, he organized the pile of swept debris, separating metal shavings from dirt, nuts and bolts from genuine garbage. Mac watched from beneath the hood of a 1973 Harley Sportster. "You always this precise?" "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Makes me feel old." Mac wiped his hands on a rag. "You know anything about engines?" "No, sir." Eli caught himself. "No." "Want to learn?" Eli looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Can't have you just sweeping forever. Gets boring. Come here." For the next hour, Mac taught him the basics. How to identify different engine components, the order of operations in a rebuild, the sound a properly tuned carburetor made versus one that needed adjustment. He explained with the patience of someone who understood that teaching was an investment, that knowledge passed between generations was how traditions survived. Eli absorbed everything like a desert drinking rain. He asked questions, made connections, demonstrated the kind of intelligence that got buried under trauma but never disappeared completely. And Mac, who'd spent 15 years in prison for manslaughter and learned mechanics from an old-timer who'd seen the value underneath the violence, recognized something familiar in the kid's desperate need to understand how broken things could be fixed. The afternoon passed. Outside, the January storm intensified, throwing ice against the garage walls. Inside, the space heaters kept the cold at bay. and the fluorescent lights buzzed their insect song, and slowly, so slowly Eli almost didn't notice, the knot of fear in his chest began to loosen. When the light started fading, Mac handed him $20. Same time Thursday? Eli stared at the money. It was more than he'd expected. More than Wade gave him in a month. Yes, thank you. Don't thank me. You earned it. Back in the main clubhouse, Graves looked up from a ledger he'd been reviewing. The other bikers had cleared out, leaving just the sergeant-at-arms and Tina restocking the bar. You got a phone at your foster house? Graves asked. Yes. Graves wrote a number on a napkin. That's my cell. You run into trouble. You call. Doesn't matter what time. Understood? Eli took the napkin like it was something sacred. Why are you helping me? Graves closed the ledger. His expression was unreadable, hard and distant, like he was looking at something far away that only he could see. Because nobody helped me when I was your age, and I spent the next 30 years learning to live with that. Maybe you'll do better. He stood and pulled on his leather cut. Go home, kid. Stay out of trouble. We'll see you Thursday. Eli walked back to Oak Street as the storm turned the world white. The $20 felt heavy in his pocket. The napkin with Graves' number was folded carefully in his other hand. And for the first time in 7 months, he felt something that wasn't quite hope, but might become it if given enough time and protection. The foster house loomed dark against the storm. Wade's truck sat in the driveway, engine ticking as it cooled. Eli stood at the end of the walkway, gathering courage, trying to remember how to make himself small and invisible. Inside, Wade was waiting. Where the hell have you been? Eli set his backpack by the door. Detention. Bullshit. School called. Said you left on time. The first blow caught him across the face, snapping his head sideways. The second drove into his ribs, the already cracked ribs that Graves had seen, that Mac had pretended not to notice while teaching him about carburetors. Eli went down hard, his vision whiting out from pain. Wade grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the basement stairs. You think you can lie to me? You think you're special? I've dealt with dozens of little shits like you, and they all learned the same lesson eventually. Eli's hand fumbled in his pocket, closing around the napkin with Graves' number. But his phone was in his backpack by the door, too far away, and Wade was already throwing him down the stairs into the darkness. The door slammed. The lock clicked. Eli lay on the cold concrete floor of the basement, breathing through broken ribs, tasting blood, listening to Wade's footsteps recede upstairs. The darkness was complete, absolute. The kind of darkness that had its own weight and texture. He unfolded the napkin even though he couldn't see the numbers written there. Just knowing he had it felt like something. A connection to a world where men with violent pasts and scarred knuckles had still noticed he was in trouble. Where someone had looked at him and seen something worth protecting. The hours passed. The storm raged outside. And somewhere 3 miles away, in a converted garage beneath a flickering neon sign, Graves sat at the wooden table and stared at his phone, wondering why he'd given his personal number to a kid he'd just met, and already knowing, with the certainty of someone who'd spent 3 combat tours learning to read situations, that this wasn't over, not even close. Thursday afternoon, Eli showed up at the clubhouse with new bruises and a limp he tried to hide. Max saw it immediately but said nothing, just handed him the broom and went back to work on the Sportster. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken understanding. Both of them knew what was happening. Both of them knew there were laws about this kind of thing, procedures, proper channels. And both of them knew that sometimes the system failed, that sometimes proper channels led nowhere, that sometimes the rules protected the wrong people. Eli swept with the same precise intensity as before. When Mac called him over to help with the carburetor rebuild, he moved carefully, protecting his damaged side. His hand shook slightly when he tried to hold the small components, but he didn't complain, didn't explain, just focused on the work like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of engine work and low conversation. Mac explained throttle response. Eli asked intelligent questions. Outside, the Montana winter continued its assault on anything foolish enough to exist. When the other bikers started arriving for the evening, Eli expected to be sent home. Instead, Tina brought him a plate from the diner. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of hot meal that felt like love translated into food. He ate at the bar while the card game started at the table behind him. Cole, the young biker with neck tattoos, dealt cards with quick, practiced hands. Kid's becoming a fixture. We gonna start charging him rent? Leave it alone, Max said quietly. I'm just saying, we're not running a daycare. I said leave it. Graves walked in from the back office, carrying a folder. He stopped when he saw Eli at the bar, took in the fresh bruises and the careful way the kid was sitting, and something dark flickered across his expression. Eli, come here. Eli set down his fork and crossed to where Graves stood by the table. Up close, he could see the scars on the sergeant-at-arms knuckles, the faded ink of military tattoos disappearing under his cut, the flat, dead quality in his eyes that came from seeing too much death and deciding to stop feeling about it. Something you want to tell me? Graves asked. Eli shook his head. You're limping. Fell down the stairs. Bullshit. Graves' voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. You came to us for a reason. You asked for work when you should be asking for help. So I'm going to ask you one time, and I want a straight answer. Is your foster father hurting you? The clubhouse had gone silent again. All the bikers were watching now, their card game forgotten. Tina stood behind the bar with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Even the space heaters seemed to have stopped their rattling. Eli felt the weight of all those eyes. The question sat in the air like smoke. His throat felt too tight to speak, and part of him wanted to run, out the door, into the storm, anywhere that wasn't here with these dangerous men asking questions he didn't know how to answer. But another part of him, a smaller, more desperate part, remembered Graves kneeling beside him that first day and seeing the bruises without needing explanation. Remembered Mac teaching him about engines with patient hands. Remembered Tina building him sandwiches and never asking for payment. Yes, he whispered. Eats. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Graves studied him for a long moment, then looked at Mac. You see those ribs when he was working? Yeah. No. How bad? Cracked, maybe. Possibly worse. Graves nodded slowly, like Mac had confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked around the table at his brothers, men who'd served time, fought wars, survived things that broke normal people. Men who understood violence and damage and the cost of getting involved in situations that weren't technically their business. We've got a problem, Graves said. Cole leaned back in his chair. Boss, if we go after this guy, we're looking at legal trouble. Assault, kidnapping maybe. We touch him, every cop in the county will come down on this clubhouse. So we don't touch him, another biker said. His name was Reaper, and he had the kind of face that suggested his road name was earned, not given. We call social services. Let them handle it. Social services put him there in the first place, Max said quietly. They'll investigate. It'll take weeks. And in the meantime, the kid goes back to that house every night with a man who knows he's been talking. The truth of that settled over the room like snow. Graves turned back to Eli. How long has this been going on? Most 7 months. And nobody noticed? Eli shrugged. People don't see what they don't want to see. The simple, devastating truth of that statement hit the bikers like a physical blow. Because every man in that room had experience with being invisible when it mattered, with crying for help in a language that respectable society pretended not to understand, with learning that the world was full of people who valued comfort over justice and closed eyes over difficult truths. Graves made a decision. You're staying here tonight. Eli blinked. What? Boss. Son. We've got a storage room in back. Hasn't been used in years, but it's got a cot and a space heater. You'll stay there. Tomorrow we start making calls. Lawyers, social services, anyone who'll listen. But you're not going back to that house tonight. Wade will call the police. Let him. Graves' smile was cold and sharp. I'd love to explain to the cops why a 12-year-old kid was so desperate he ran away to a biker clubhouse. I'm sure that conversation will go great for your foster father. Tina moved from behind the bar. I'll get him blankets, and we should document those injuries properly. Photos, written descriptions, everything. Build a case. Good idea, Graves said. Then, to the room. We're unanimous on this? The bikers looked at each other. This was the moment where they could back out, where caution and self-preservation could override whatever impulse was pulling them toward this scared kid with broken ribs and desperate eyes. Getting involved meant risk, meant exposure, meant potentially bringing down law enforcement attention on a clubhouse that survived by staying just beneath official notice. But Mac spoke first, his voice rough as sandpaper. "I'm in, all it." "Yeah," Reaper added. "Fuck it, I'm in too." Cole hesitated, then nodded. "In." One by one, the others echoed their agreement. Not because it was smart, not because it was safe, but because every man in that room remembered what it felt like to need help and find only silence. And maybe this time, just this once, they could be the help they'd never had. Graves looked at Eli. "We're not perfect people, kid. We've done things, bad things. But you're under this roof now, and that means something. It means you're protected. Understood?" Eli nodded, not trusting himself to speak around the tightness in his throat. "Good. Now finish your dinner. Tina, get that storage room set up. Mac, find the first aid kit. I want those ribs looked at properly. Everyone else, back to the card game. We've got work to do, but tonight we're keeping it normal. Kid's been through enough without us treating him like a crisis." The clubhouse resumed its rhythm, but something had shifted. The atmosphere felt different, charged, purposeful, like the moment before a storm breaks and the lightning starts. Eli finished his meatloaf while Tina disappeared into the back of the building, and Mac pulled out a medical kit that looked military grade, and Graves made calls to lawyers who'd worked with the MC before. Later, in the storage room that smelled like old cardboard and motor oil, Eli lay on a cot under 3 blankets and stared at the ceiling. He could hear voices from the main room, low, serious conversations about custody laws and emergency placements and building documentation. Outside, the wind howled. His ribs ached with every breath. But for the first time in 7 months, he felt safe. 3 miles away, Wade Garrison stood in the kitchen of the Foster house and stared at his phone. The kid hadn't come home. That wasn't like him. Eli was too scared to pull a stunt like running away, which meant someone was helping him. And that someone was probably those bikers he'd seen the kid watching from the road. Wade poured another whiskey and considered his options. He could call the police, report Eli as missing, but that would bring questions, wellness checks, possibly an investigation into the bruises the kid was probably showing people right now. The smarter play was to wait, let the bikers think they'd won, then remind everyone involved why Wade Garrison had managed to foster 19 kids over the years, despite the complaints and transfers and whispered concerns, because the system protected its own. And Wade knew how to work the system better than any gang of criminals in leather cuts. He smiled into his whiskey and waited for morning. Back at the clubhouse, Graves sat alone at the wooden table after the others had gone home or crashed in the back rooms. The folder he'd been carrying earlier lay open in front of him, full of documents he had obtained through contacts that ranged from barely legal to definitely not. Documents about Eli's case file, about Wade Garrison's history as a foster parent, about complaints that had been filed and mysteriously closed, about a pattern that became obvious once you knew to look for it, and at the bottom of the folder, a single sheet that made Graves' blood run cold. Information about Eli's biological mother, Rachel Mercer. Disappeared 12 years ago under circumstances that the police had declared suspicious but inconclusive. Last known address, the same house on Oak Street where Wade Garrison now collected government checks for taking care of her son. Graves closed the folder and stared at the flickering neon sign in the window. Outside, the Montana winter raged. Inside, a 12-year-old kid slept under blankets provided by criminals who'd decided he was worth protecting. And somewhere in the darkness, the truth about Rachel Mercer waited like a bomb that hadn't finished exploding. Graves reached for his phone and made one more call, this one to a former Marine captain who now ran private investigations out of Billings. "I need everything you can find on a missing person case," he said when the line connected. Rachel Mercer. Disappeared January 2014, last known residence Ashford, Montana. And I need it yesterday. The voice on the other end asked questions. Graves answered them. The conversation lasted 10 minutes and cost the MC money they couldn't really spare. But as Graves ended the call and looked toward the storage room where Eli slept, he knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning, because the kid hadn't stumbled into their clubhouse looking for work. He'd stumbled into something much darker, A mystery that reached back 12 years and involved a missing woman, a violent foster father, and secrets that people had killed to protect. And the Black Vultures MC, whether they'd meant to or not, had just declared war on whatever darkness lived in that house on Oak Street. The storm outside intensified. The neon sign flickered and died, plunging the clubhouse into shadow. And in the sudden darkness, Graves smiled, the cold, anticipatory smile of a man who'd spent 3 combat tours learning how to hunt monsters and had just found a new target. This wasn't over, not even close. Morning came to the clubhouse like a threat wrapped in gray light. Eli woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors and voices speaking in the controlled tones men used when they were trying not to wake someone, but knew they already had. His ribs screamed when he sat up, and for a disorienting moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then the smell of motor oil and old coffee brought it back. The storage room, the bikers. Wade's absence like a missing tooth he kept touching with his tongue. He pulled on his shoes and limped into the main room. Graves stood at the bar with a phone pressed to his ear, his face carved from stone in exhaustion. Max sat at the wooden table surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, his nicotine-stained fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the scarred surface. Tina was refilling the coffee pot with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on pure determination and spite. Nobody had slept much. Graves ended his call and looked at Eli. Social Services is sending someone this afternoon. You're going to tell them everything, every bruise, every beating, every time Wade locked you in that basement. Understood? Eli nodded, his throat tight. Good. Tina's making breakfast. Eat something. You look like death. Boy, the food appeared. Eggs, bacon, toast. But Eli's stomach was clenched too tight to accept more than a few bites. He pushed the plate around while the bikers continued their low, urgent conversations. He caught fragments, documentation, emergency placement, restraining order, probable cause. Legal terms that meant his life was about to be dissected by strangers with clipboards and the power to send him back to Wade if they decided the evidence wasn't compelling enough. Cole walked in from outside, shaking snow from his leather cut. Wade's truck just drove past, slow, like he was looking for something. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Graves set down his coffee with careful precision. He say anything? Didn't stop, just rolled by real slow and kept going. Marking territory, Max said quietly, letting us know he's not scared. Reaper leaned against the wall near the front window, his arms crossed over a chest covered in faded military ink. Should be scared. Stupid not to be. He thinks the system protects him, Graves said, and he's not completely wrong. Eli's hands started shaking. He pressed them flat against the table to hide it, but Tina noticed. She always noticed. She crossed to him and refilled his orange juice without comment, her presence solid and maternal in a way that made Eli's chest ache with something he couldn't name. The social worker arrived at 2 o'clock. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she looked exactly like every other caseworker Eli had ever met. Tired eyes, professional smile, carrying a bag heavy with files and the weight of too many cases. She shook hands with Graves, nodded politely to the other bikers, and asked if there was somewhere private she could talk with Eli. They used the back office. Small room, dusty desk, walls covered in club bylaws and framed photographs of rides from years past. Margaret sat across from Eli and pulled out a notebook with pages already filled with other children's stories, other emergencies, other situations where the system had arrived too late or not at all. Eli, I understand you've been staying here. Can you tell me why you didn't go home last night? And so he told her. Everything. The beatings that started 2 days after placement, Wade's careful precision in choosing spots that wouldn't show during casual welfare checks. The basement with its concrete floor and absolute darkness. The escalating violence over 7 months. The way Wade's voice went flat and cold before the worst nights. The hunger. The fear. The absolute certainty that nobody would help because nobody ever had. Margaret wrote it all down in shorthand that looked like secret code. Her expression stayed professionally neutral, but Eli saw something flicker in her eyes when he described the basement. Recognition? Maybe. Or guilt. Why didn't you tell anyone before now? She asked. Who was I supposed to tell? The question sat between them like an accusation. Margaret clicked her pen twice, a nervous gesture that suggested she didn't have a good answer. I'm going to need to photograph your injuries, she said finally, and then we need to discuss next steps. The MC can't keep you here permanently. That's not a licensed placement. But given what you've told me, I'm not sending you back to Wade's house either. Where then? Emergency group home, probably, until we can arrange a new foster placement. Don't. Eli felt something crack inside his chest. Another institution, another temporary place full of temporary people. Another stop on the endless circuit of places that weren't home and never would be. Margaret must have seen it on his face because her expression softened slightly. I know it's not ideal, but it's safe, and we'll move as fast as we can. She took her photographs, clinical documentation of violence translated into evidence. Each flash felt like exposure, like being stripped down to nothing but damage. When she finished, Eli pulled his shirt back on and tried to remember how to feel anything except numb. They returned to the main room. Margaret spoke with Graves in low tones near the bar, while the other bikers pretended to play cards and actually watched every movement, every gesture, ready to intervene if the conversation went in directions they didn't like. We'll be opening a full investigation into Wade Garrison, Margaret was saying, but these things take time, weeks, probably, maybe longer. Kid doesn't have weeks, Graves said flatly. I understand, but there are procedures. Fuck your procedures. His voice stayed quiet, controlled, but carried enough edge to make Margaret take a step back. That man has been beating this kid for 7 months under your agency's supervision. You put him there. You're supposed to monitor these placements. So either you move fast, or we're going to start asking very loud questions about how your agency let this happen. Margaret's professional mask cracked slightly. Mr. Graves, I appreciate your concern, but threatening me won't help Eli's case. Not threatening, just explaining the situation. He leaned closer. Because here's what happens if you move slow. Wade lawyers up, claims the kid is lying, says we're coaching him. Your agency starts worrying about liability. And suddenly this becomes about protecting the system instead of protecting a 12-year-old who's been sleeping in a storage room because it's safer than the house you placed him in. The accuracy of that scenario landed like a fist. Margaret looked at Eli, sitting small and silent at the wooden table, and something in her expression shifted. She'd been doing this job for 15 years. She'd seen this story before, watched it play out with minor variations, but always the same ending. The system protecting itself while children fell through the cracks. I'll move as fast as I can, she said finally, but I need you to understand, Eli can't stay here. This isn't a licensed facility. Then license it. That's not how it works. Make it how it works. Graves straightened to his full height. Because the alternative is we tell every news outlet in Montana how a kid got beaten half to death while under state supervision, and how when he finally ran away, he found more safety with a motorcycle club than with your agency. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Eli again, really looked, like she was seeing him for the first time as an actual person instead of another file in her overflowing caseload. 1 week, she said. I'll get him into the emergency group home today, and we'll fast-track a new placement. But you need to stay out of this investigation. No vigilante justice. No contact with Wade. If you interfere, it could compromise the case. Graves nodded once. Understood. But Eli heard the lie underneath. Heard it in the flat tone, the careful neutrality. Graves had no intention of staying out of anything. He was just telling Margaret what she needed to hear so she'd leave and let them work. After she left, the clubhouse fell into tense silence. Tina cleared coffee cups with more force than necessary. Mac lit a cigarette and stared at nothing. Cole paced near the window, his young face tight with frustration. Group home, Reaper said finally. That's the best they can do? System's overwhelmed, Graves said. More kids than placements. She's probably working 60-hour weeks trying to keep up. Still bullshit. Yeah, it is. Eli stood from the table. His legs felt unsteady like the floor had turned liquid underneath him. I should pack my stuff. What stuff? Mac asked gently. You showed up here with a backpack. The truth of that settled over the room. Eli owned nothing, was nothing, in the eyes of a system that measured value in paperwork and proper procedures. Just another damaged kid cycling through temporary places until he aged out or broke completely. Graves crossed to him. Listen to me. The group home is temporary. Margaret's going to work fast. She said so, and I believe her. You keep your head down, follow the rules, and we'll stay in touch. Understood? You won't forget about me? The question came out smaller than Eli intended. Something flickered across Graves' face, pain maybe, or recognition. No, we won't forget. 2 hours later, Margaret returned with a sedan and another caseworker. They drove Eli across town to a 2-story house that looked normal from the outside. White siding, front porch, flowers that had died in the winter cold. Inside, it smelled like industrial cleaner and too many people living in too little space. The house mother was named Patricia. Older woman, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that had seen enough broken children to stop being shocked by new ones. She showed Eli to a bedroom he'd share with 2 other boys, gave him a schedule printed on laminated paper, and explained the rules in a voice that suggested she'd given this speech 10,000 times. Eli sat on his assigned bed, bottom bunk, thin mattress, sheets that smelled like bleach, and stared at the wall. His roommates weren't home yet. The house was quiet except for sounds of other kids moving through hallways, doors opening and closing, the white noise of temporary people living temporary lives. He'd been here 3 hours when his phone buzzed. Text from Graves. You good? Eli stared at the message for a long time before responding. Yeah. But yeah, all right. Another buzz. Bullshit. But you're safe. That's what matters. Eli almost smiled. Almost. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Wake at 7. Breakfast with 12 other kids who'd learned not to ask questions about each other's damage. School, where Eli sat in the back of classrooms and tried to remember what normal felt like. Dinner at 6. Homework until 8. Lights out at 9:30. A schedule designed to create structure in lives that had been defined by chaos. But at night, lying in the bottom bunk while his roommates breathed in sleep above and beside him, Eli thought about the clubhouse, the smell of motor oil and coffee. Mac's patient hands teaching him about carburetors, the way Graves had looked at his bruises and immediately understood, the feeling, brief and probably illusory, that he'd found people who might actually protect him. On the 4th day, Graves called. How you holding up? Bots. Fine. Eli kept his voice low. His roommates were doing homework at the desk by the window. That's twice you've lied to me. Want to try for 3? Eli almost smiled again. The group home is okay. Patricia's strict but not mean. The food's decent. I have my own drawer. Margaret says they're working on a new placement. Some couple in Billings who specialize in older kids with trauma histories. Okay, you don't sound excited. I've had 9 placements in 6 years, Eli said quietly. Excitement isn't really part of the process anymore. Silence on the line, then, yeah, I get that. How's the garage? Mac's restoring a 68 Panhead, says it's got good bones but needs a complete teardown, kind of like us. Graves' voice carried the ghost of dark humor. You still want to learn engine work? Yes. Good, because when this settles down, you're coming back. Even if it's just afternoons, we don't quit on people, Eli. You need to understand that. The words hit harder than Eli expected. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear, not trusting himself to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. I have to go, he managed finally. Patricia has rules about phone time. All right, call if you need anything. I mean that. The line went dead. Eli sat on his bunk staring at his phone until one of his roommates, a 14-year-old named Marcus with burned scars on his neck, looked over. Who was that? Your dad? No, just someone I know. Marcus studied him with the flat wisdom of a kid who'd learned to read people as survival skill. Sounded important. Maybe. Important's good. Most of us don't have that. The statement landed like truth. Most kids in the group home didn't have anyone on the outside who checked in, who cared, who remembered they existed. They were system kids, raised by bureaucracy and rotating caseworkers, loved by nobody in particular, and therefore by nobody at all. But Eli had a biker sergeant-at-arms with ice-cold eyes and old war trauma who called to check on him. Had a mechanic who'd taught him about engines. Had found something that looked almost like family in the last place anyone would expect. That night, Wade Garrison sat in his kitchen and read the official notification from social services. Investigation pending. Emergency removal. Pending interview. The language was bureaucratic and cold, designed to communicate facts without emotion. He'd been through this before. Twice, actually. Both times, the investigation had dragged on for months before quietly closing with recommendations for improved oversight and additional training. Both times, he'd been allowed to continue fostering, because the system needed placements more than it needed to admit when it made mistakes. This time felt different, though. The bikers had gotten involved. That complicated things, made it public in ways that bureaucracies hated. And the kid, Eli, had actually found people willing to fight for him. That almost never happened. Wade poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and considered his options. He could cooperate with the investigation, play the misunderstood foster parent trying his best with a difficult child. That usually worked. Caseworkers wanted to believe placements could be salvaged, that situations were more complicated than they appeared. Or he could disappear the evidence. The thought came calm and cold, not as a revelation, but as a logical conclusion. Because there was evidence, real evidence. And it wasn't just about the kid's bruises or the basement or the carefully documented pattern of violence. It was about Rachel Mercer and what had happened in this house 12 years ago, and what Wade had buried in the crawlspace when he'd realized nobody was going to come looking. He finished his whiskey and made a decision. Back at the clubhouse, Graves sat in the back office surrounded by documents his private investigator contact had sent over. Rachel Mercer's case file, police reports, witness statements, a paper trail that went nowhere because nobody had wanted to follow it. Rachel had been 24 when she disappeared. Single mother, working 2 jobs, no family, no support system. The last person to see her alive had been Wade Garrison, who'd been dating her casually for 3 months. She'd gone to his house one January night to drop off some belongings she'd been storing there. Never came home. Wade had reported her missing the next morning. Concerned boyfriend, cooperative with police. Genuinely worried, or so it seemed. The investigation had gone nowhere, no body, no evidence of foul play. Just another young woman who'd walked out of her life and into the statistical void. 6 months later, Wade had somehow gained emergency custody of her son. Eli had been 3 months old. Graves stared at that last detail until the words stopped making sense. 3 months old. Taken from whatever temporary care he'd been placed in and given to the man who'd been the last person to see his mother alive. The implication sat in Graves's chest like a stone. He picked up his phone and called the private investigator. I need you to get me access to Wade Garrison's property. I need to know what's in that crawl space. That's breaking and entering. I'm aware. If you find something, it won't be admissible in court. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Don't care about court, Graves said quietly. I care about truth. The investigator was silent for a moment. You understand what you're asking me to help you do? Yeah, I do. All right, give me 48 hours. Yay. Graves ended the call and sat in the darkness of the office, listening to the sounds of the clubhouse outside his door. Voices, laughter, the clink of bottles. Men who'd found something like peace in this converted garage. This makeshift family, built from the wreckage of their individual traumas. And now they'd invited a 12-year-old kid into that family. A kid whose mother had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. A kid who'd been placed with the primary suspect. Graves understood, with the cold certainty of someone who'd spent 3 combat tours learning to identify threats, that this was about to get much worse before it got better. The next afternoon, Margaret called with news. We found a placement, couple in Billings, Sarah and Tom Henderson. They fostered 6 kids over the years, all positive outcomes. They're willing to take Eli on emergency status. When? Graves asked. Tomorrow. I'll pick him up from the group home at noon. Go. That fast? You wanted fast. Margaret's voice carried an edge. And honestly, the sooner we get him out of Ashford, the safer he'll be. Wade's been asking questions, calling the office. He hasn't threatened anyone directly, but there's an undertone I don't like. Graves's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of undertone? The kind that makes me think he's not going to accept this quietly. So yes, we're moving fast. Eli will be in Billings by tomorrow evening, enrolled in a new school by Monday. Clean break. After she hung up, Graves sat very still. Clean break. Like it was that simple. Like you could just move a kid 2 hours away and erase the history, the connections, The fact that Eli's entire life was wrapped up in mysteries that nobody had bothered to solve. He called Mac. Kids being moved to Billings tomorrow. Silence on the line, then, that's good, safer. Yeah. You don't sound convinced. I'm not, Graves admitted. Something about this whole situation feels wrong. Wade getting custody in the first place. Rachel's disappearance never being properly investigated. The timing of everything. You think Wade killed her? It wasn't a question. Mac had been reading the same documents, drawing the same conclusions. Yeah, Graves said. I do. Can you prove it? Working on it. That night, Eli lay in his bunk at the group home and stared at the ceiling. Patricia had told him about Billings during dinner. Another placement, another fresh start, another chance to pretend he could be normal. She'd said it like good news, and maybe for most kids it would be. But Eli kept thinking about the clubhouse, about Mac's patient hands and Graves' protective intensity, and the way the bikers had looked at him like he mattered, like he was worth protecting. And now he was being moved 2 hours away to live with strangers who probably meant well, but would never really understand. Who would try to fix him with therapy and structure and love that felt theoretical rather than real? His phone buzzed. Text from Graves. Heard about Billings. Want to see you before you go. Eli typed back. When? Tomorrow morning. I'll clear it with Patricia. We'll come get you for breakfast. Okay. Another buzz. This isn't goodbye. You understand that? Distance doesn't change shit. Eli stared at the message until his vision blurred. He'd heard versions of that promise before, from caseworkers and teachers and previous foster parents who'd meant it at the time, but eventually got busy with their real lives and forgot about the temporary kid who'd passed through. But something about Graves felt different, more solid, like a promise carved from stone instead of spoken into air. Understood, he typed back. Morning arrived gray and cold. Patricia let Eli leave with Graves and Mac without her usual bureaucratic resistance. Maybe because she recognized something in the biker's eyes that suggested arguing would be unwise, or maybe because she understood that some connections mattered more than procedure. They took him to Tina's diner across the highway, early enough that the place was mostly empty, just truckers nursing coffee, and the morning waitress who knew everyone's order by heart. They sat in a corner booth with cracked red vinyl and a table scarred by decades of silverware and hard conversations. Tina brought food without asking, pancakes, eggs, bacon, the kind of breakfast that felt like armor against the world. Eli ate mechanically, not tasting much, while Graves and Mac sat across from him in leather cuts that smelled like winter rides and cigarette smoke. Billings is good, Mac said finally. Bigger city, better schools. You'll have opportunities. Eli nodded. You'll also have us, Graves added. 2 hours isn't far. We ride up there regularly. You need something, you call. We'll come. No questions asked. Why? The question burst out before Eli could stop it. Why do you care? You don't know me. I'm just some kid who walked into your clubhouse. Graves leaned back against the vinyl, his ice-cold eyes studying Eli with unsettling intensity. You want the truth? Yeah. Because when I was your age, I lived in a house where my old man beat the shit out of me every time he got drunk, which was most nights. I told teachers, told neighbors, told anyone who'd listen. And you know what happened? Eli shook his head. Nothing. People looked the other way, told themselves it wasn't their business, that families had their own way of handling things. So I learned to survive alone. And when I finally got old enough to leave, I carried all that damage with me. Spent the next 20 years trying to outrun it. Get barred shapes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. You remind me of who I was, and maybe if someone had stepped up for me back then, I wouldn't have spent 3 tours overseas learning to be comfortable with violence. Maybe I'd be different, better. But nobody did step up, so here we are. The honesty hit like a physical blow. Eli looked at Mac, who nodded slowly. My story's different but ends the same place, Mac said. Prison at 19 for killing a man who had it coming. Lost 15 years because I didn't have anyone teaching me. There were other ways to handle problems. So when we see a kid in trouble, we remember what it felt like to be that kid, and we try to do better. Eli's throat felt too tight to speak. He focused on his pancakes, cutting them into precise squares, trying to maintain some kind of control over something. We're not saints, Graves continued. We've done bad things, hurt people, made choices that keep us up at night. But maybe that makes us exactly the right people to protect you, because we understand the darkness. We've lived in it, and we know how to fight it. Before Eli could respond, the diner door opened. 3 men walked in. Not customers, based on the way they moved. Purposeful. Scanning the room, their eyes landed on the corner booth. One of them was Wade Garrison. The temperature in the diner dropped. Graves and Mac both went very still, their bodies shifting into readiness in ways that were barely visible but absolutely clear. Truckers at the counter sensed the change and quietly moved toward the door. Wade crossed the diner with the confidence of someone who didn't believe he could be touched. He stopped at their booth, his smile cold and proprietary. "Eli, time to come home." "No," Eli said, his voice smaller than he wanted. "Wasn't asking." Wade's eyes moved to Graves. "You must be the biker playing hero. Appreciate you looking after my boy, but I'll take it from here." "He's not your boy," Graves said quietly. "And he's not going anywhere with you." "That's not your decision." Wade pulled out his phone and showed them a screen. "Got a text from my lawyer 20 minutes ago. Emergency custody hearing got delayed, paperwork issue. Which means, legally, Eli is still my responsibility." The words landed like a bomb. Margaret hadn't mentioned any delay, which meant either she didn't know yet, or someone had just pulled strings Wade had access to. "Doesn't matter," Graves said. "Kid's not leaving with you." Wade's smile widened. "You gonna stop me? Because that's kidnapping. Interference with custody. I could have cops here in 5 minutes." "Do it." Graves' voice stayed absolutely calm. "Call them. We'll all sit here and wait. And while we're waiting, we can discuss why Eli's covered in bruises. Why he'd rather sleep in a storage room than go back to your house. Why social services is investigating you for child abuse." Something flickered in Wade's expression. Not fear exactly, flickered, but calculation. He looked at the 2 men sitting across from Eli, reading the violence that lived just beneath their calm surfaces, weighing his options. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yeah," Graves agreed. "It's really not." Wade turned and walked out, his 2 companions following. The diner exhaled collectively. Tina appeared from behind the counter with a coffee pot and 3 mugs, her hands shaking slightly. "That was stupid," she said, pouring coffee. "He's going to come back with police." "Let him," Max said. "We didn't do anything illegal yet." Graves pulled out his phone and called Margaret. The conversation was brief and tense. When he hung up, his expression was carved from dark stone. She didn't know about the delay. Someone filed an emergency motion. Some technicality about improper documentation. Hearing's been pushed to next week. "Which means?" Eli asked. "Which means legally, Wade still has custody. And we can't stop him from taking you." The words sat in the air like poison. All their plans, Billings, the new placement, the clean break, dissolved into bureaucratic vapor. Eli was still Wade's property in the eyes of the law, and now Wade knew exactly where to find him. Graves' phone rang again, different number. He answered, listened, his expression going from grim to something darker and more dangerous. "Understood," he said finally. "We're moving now." He ended the call and looked at Mac. That was the PI. He got into Wade's crawl space. And? He found something, clothing, women's clothing wrapped in plastic, hidden under the foundation for 12 years. The implications crashed over the booth like cold water. Eli felt his stomach lurch. "My mother," he whispered. Graves nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe." "So we go to the police," Eli said. "Right now. They arrest him. It's over. Tut. Can't." Mac's voice was gentle but firm. "Evidence was obtained illegally. Won't hold up in court. Could even get thrown out as fruit of the poisonous tree. And without that evidence, there's no case. So what do we do?" Graves and Mac exchanged a long look. One of those silent conversations that came from years of writing together, fighting together, making hard choices together. "We handle it ourselves," Graves said finally. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not going back to that group home. It means we're taking you somewhere safe while we figure this out. And it means Wade Garrison is about to discover what happens when you threaten someone under Black Vulture's protection." Eli's hands were shaking. "This is because of me. I brought this on you." "No," Graves said with absolute certainty. "This is because of him. Because he's been getting away with this for 12 years. Because the system failed your mother and then failed you. We're just correcting that failure. You'll lose everything, the clubhouse, your freedom. They'll arrest you. Maybe. Graves' cold smile was back, the one that suggested he'd made peace with violence a long time ago. But that's our choice to make, not yours. Tina set down the coffee pot. You boys are about to do something monumentally stupid. Yeah, Mac agreed. Probably. I can't talk you out of it? No. She sighed and pulled out her phone. Then I'm calling the others. If you're going to war, you're doing it with full support. 20 minutes later, the diner parking lot filled with motorcycles. 8 bikers total. Not the full club, but enough. They stood in a loose circle near their bikes, smoke from cigarettes rising into the gray morning, their leather cuts dark against the winter landscape. Graves laid it out simply. Wade's coming for the kid. He's got legal custody for at least another week. We can either hand Eli over and hope the system eventually works, or we can make a different choice. What choice? Cole asked. We keep him safe until Margaret can get the custody hearing resolved. Hide him. Protect him. And we make sure Wade understands that touching this kid again means going to war with all of us. Reaper lit a fresh cigarette. That's obstruction, custody interference. Could get us federal charges. I know, but you're doing it anyway. Yeah. The bikers looked at each other. Some of them had families. Day jobs. Lives that existed outside the clubhouse. Getting involved meant risking all of that. Meant potentially going to prison for a kid most of them had known less than a week. One by one, they nodded. Fuck it, Cole said. I'm in. In? Reaper added. The others echoed agreement, not because it was smart, not because it was legal, but because somewhere along the line they'd all decided that standing between the vulnerable and the monsters was more important than safety. Graves turned to Eli. Last chance to back out. You stay with us. You're part of this. If it goes bad for everyone. You want out? Margaret can take you to Billings right now. Eli looked at the circle of dangerous men who'd decided he was worth protecting. Men with scars and prison tattoos and trauma that showed in every line of their faces. Men who were offering him something he'd never had. A family that fought. I'm staying, he said. All right then. Graves pulled on his leather cut. Mac, get Eli to the safe house. Rest of us are going to have a conversation with Wade. What kind of conversation? Eli asked. Graves' smile was colder than the Montana winter. The kind that makes sure he understands exactly what he's up against. The bikers mounted their Harleys. Engines roared to life, a mechanical thunder that echoed across the parking lot. Mac led Eli to his bike, a massive Road King with worn leather saddlebags and highway dust coating the chrome. Ever ridden before? Mac asked. No. Hold on tight. Don't lean in turns. If I tap your leg, it means cops. If I tap twice, it means trouble. Eli climbed on behind him, his arms wrapping around Mac's leather cut. The engine vibrated through his entire body, power and danger barely contained. Around them, the other bikes lined up, ready to ride. Graves pulled alongside them. Keep him safe. Always, Mac said. Then they were moving, 8 Harleys tearing out of the parking lot in formation, their engines screaming defiance at the gray morning. They split at the highway, 7 bikes heading toward Oak Street, one carrying Eli in the opposite direction. Eli looked back once and saw the others disappearing toward Wade's house, toward confrontation, toward whatever came next. And for the first time since his mother disappeared 12 years ago, Eli realized he wasn't alone anymore. He'd found people willing to go to war for him. The question now was whether any of them would survive what came next. The safe house was a hunting cabin 40 miles outside Ashford, buried so deep in pine forest that even the winter light couldn't fully penetrate the canopy. Mac killed the engine in front of a structure that looked abandoned. Warped wooden siding, a porch sagging under accumulated snow, windows dark as dead eyes. But when he unlocked the door, the interior was surprisingly maintained. Generator-powered heat, canned food stacked on metal shelving, a gun safe bolted to the wall. The kind of place men kept for when civilization stopped being an option. Clubs had this place since the 90s, Mac explained, lighting the propane heater. Previous owner used it for hunting. We use it for when we need to disappear. Eli stood in the middle of the single room, his arms wrapped around himself, still vibrating from the motorcycle ride. How often do you need to disappear? More than you'd think. Mac pulled out his phone and checked for signal. 1 bar. Barely functional. You hungry? No. Eat anyway. Gonna be a long day. He heated soup on a camping stove. Chicken noodle from a can. The kind of food that existed purely for sustenance rather than pleasure. They ate in silence while the propane heater ticked and settled, fighting against the Montana cold seeping through the walls. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. Or breathing. Or ghosts. Eli pushed his soup around the bowl. What are they doing? Graves and the others? Having a conversation, Maki. You mean threatening him? Max set down his spoon and studied Eli with eyes that had seen the inside of a prison cell for 15 years. You want honesty or comfort? Honesty. Look, they're making sure Wade understands the new situation. That you're under protection now. That touching you again means consequences he won't like. They'll hurt him. Maybe. Depends how stupid he is. Mac lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the deep lines carved into his face. You have a problem with that? Eli thought about Wade's fists. The basement. 7 months of carefully calibrated violence. The way Wade had smiled in the diner like he owned Eli and always would. No, I don't have a problem with it. Something shifted in Mac's expression. Approval or recognition? Good. Because being under this club's protection means accepting how we handle things. We don't call lawyers. We don't file complaints. We handle it directly. Like criminals. Like people who understand the world doesn't run on rules written in courtrooms. Mac exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. You're 12. You still believe the system works if you just follow procedure. Give it a few more years. You'll learn. Before Eli could respond, Mac's phone buzzed. He read the message, his expression darkening. What? Eli asked. They're at Wade's house. He's not there. Where is he? That's the problem. Mac typed a response, his nicotine-stained fingers moving quickly. Wade's truck is gone. His phone's off. And according to Graves, the house looks like someone left in a hurry. Eli felt cold spread through his chest. He ran. Looks like, But why? He was confident in the diner. He said the custody hearing was delayed. Why would he run? Max stared at his phone, reading messages as they came in. Graves is wondering the same thing. Says there's something wrong with the house. Like Wade packed quick but also cleaned, wiped surfaces, removed hard drives from his computer. That's not running scared. That's planned. Mac finished. Yeah. They sat in tense silence while implications accumulated like snow. Wade hadn't panicked when confronted by bikers, hadn't called police or lawyers. Instead, he disappeared after carefully covering his tracks, which suggested he'd been preparing for this possibility, which suggested this wasn't about losing custody of one foster kid. This was about something much bigger. Mac's phone rang. He answered, listened, his face going carefully blank. Understood. We'll stay put. He ended the call and looked at Eli with an expression that made the cold in the boy's chest turn to ice. That was Graves. They found something in Wade's house. What? A file cabinet in the basement, hidden behind drywall, full of documents. Eli's throat felt too tight. What kind of documents? Records? Going back 20 years, foster placements, kids who came through Wade's house? Mac's voice was flat, emotionless in the way people get when they're containing something too big to feel. 19 kids total. Most stayed a few months before emergency transfers. 3 disappeared. The room tilted. Eli gripped the edge of the table to keep from sliding off the world. Disappeared? Missing person reports filed by other caseworkers. Kids who ran away from Wade's placement and were never found. System wrote them off as runaways. Typical for the foster population. High-risk behavior. Nobody looked too hard. How old were they? Between 8 and 14. Eli's vision whited out at the edges. He forced himself to breathe through the panic rising in his chest like floodwater. My mother, Rachel. Was there anything about her? All guts. Mac nodded slowly. Letters, from her to Wade, dating back to when you were 6 months old, before she disappeared. What did they say? That she wanted you back. That Wade had convinced her to let him take temporary custody while she got her life stable. That she was ready now. That she was coming to get you. Mac's cigarette had burned down to the filter. He crushed it in an ashtray without seeming to notice. The last letter is dated January 15th, 2014, same day she disappeared. The cabin was silent except for the propane heater and Eli's ragged breathing. Outside, the wind had stopped. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. He killed her, Eli whispered. Yeah, we think so. And the other kids? Mac said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Eli stood abruptly, his chair scraping against wooden floorboards. He crossed to the window and stared out at the forest. Trees like prison bars, snow like static, the world reduced to gray and white, and the absolute certainty that he'd been living with a serial killer for 7 months. I need to throw up. He made it outside before his stomach emptied itself into the snow. He knelt there in the cold, heaving nothing, his body trying to expel horror that had already seeped too deep to vomit out. Behind him, he heard Mac's boots on the porch, but the mechanic didn't approach. Just stood there smoking a fresh cigarette, giving Eli space to fall apart. When Eli finally came back inside, Mac handed him water without comment. They sat at the table again, the propane heater ticking between them like a mechanical heart. Police need to know, Eli said finally. They will. Graves is making copies of everything before he calls it in. But here's the problem. That file cabinet is in Wade's house, which means we broke in to find it. But you didn't break in. You just walked in. Mika. Door was locked. We picked it. Technically, that's breaking and entering. Mac lit another cigarette. And even if cops overlook that, Wade's gone. Could be anywhere by now. Montana's got 10,000 places to disappear if you know the territory. So he gets away with it. Maybe. For a while. Mac exhaled smoke. But here's what you need to understand about men like Wade. They don't run because they're scared. They run because they're buying time. Getting their story straight. Preparing for the next move. What's the next move? Depends what he's protecting. If it's just himself, he stays disappeared, changes his name, starts over somewhere with a different identity and a different hunting ground. And if it's not just himself, Mac's expression went dark. Then he comes back for the evidence, makes sure nobody can prove what was in those files. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Evidence included documents, included the file cabinet, included Graves and the other bikers who'd seen the contents, included the private investigator who'd found the clothing in the crawl space, and included Eli, the one person who could testify about what Wade had done, the one person whose existence connected Wade to Rachel's disappearance. He's going to kill me, Eli said quietly. Not if we kill him first. The words dropped into the cabin like stones into water. Max said them without emotion, without drama, just a simple statement of fact. We kill him first, like it was a reasonable solution, like violence was just another tool in the box. Eli stared at the mechanic. You're serious, kid? Wade has been murdering children for 20 years. He killed your mother. He would have killed you eventually, probably was building to it. Now he's running because we caught him, and when he stops running, he's going to come back to clean up loose ends. So yeah, I'm serious. We find him before cops do, and we handle it permanent. That's murder. Yeah, it is. Mac met Eli's eyes without flinching. You got a problem with that. Speak now, because once we cross this line, there's no walking back. Eli opened his mouth to say yes. He had a problem with it. That murder was wrong. That they should let the police handle it. That civilization had rules and procedures specifically so people didn't take justice into their own hands. But the words wouldn't come, because he remembered the basement, the darkness. Wade's boots on the stairs, 7 months of violence that nobody stopped because everyone trusted the system to protect him. And the system had failed, had placed him with a serial killer, had ignored complaints, had let Wade operate for 2 decades while children disappeared into unmarked graves. No, Eli said finally. I don't have a problem with it. Mac nodded once. Then we're clear, but his phone buzzed again. Multiple messages coming in rapid sequence. He read them, his expression shifting from grim to something darker. They found something else. In Wade's garage, under a false floor. What? Personal effects? From the missing kids, jewelry, phones, ID cards. Wade kept trophies. Mac's hand shook slightly as he set down the phone. And there's something else. Photos. Recent ones. Of the clubhouse. Of Graves. Of you working in the garage. The cold in Eli's chest turned to ice. He was watching us? Yeah, and not just watching. Planning. Mac pulled up a photo on his phone and showed it to Eli. Recognize this? It was a map, hand-drawn, showing the clubhouse, the parking lot, the surrounding roads. Red X marks over the garage and the back office. Notes in the margins about patrol patterns and blind spots. Wade had been planning an attack. When? Eli asked. No date. But based on the detail, he's been working on this for days. Maybe since you first showed up at the clubhouse. So all of this, the legal delays, the emergency motions, running away, it was buying time. Getting us focused on custody hearings while he prepared to— Eli couldn't finish the sentence. To eliminate the problem, Mac finished. Yeah, that's what we're thinking. Eli's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table, trying to maintain control. How many kids? Total. How many did he kill? Files mentioned 3 confirmed missing. But there are gaps. Years where Wade didn't have any placements on record but still lived in that house. Could be more. Probably are more. And nobody noticed. System's overwhelmed. Kids go missing from foster care all the time. Most are runaways. Some come back. Some don't. After a while, caseworkers stop counting. Too depressing otherwise. The propane heater ticked. Outside, the forest was silent. And somewhere out in that wilderness, Wade Garrison was planning his next move. Mac's phone rang again. He answered on the first ring. Yeah. Eli watched the mechanic's face as he listened. Watched the color drain from already pale skin. Watched something like fear flicker across features that usually showed nothing. How bad? Mac asked. Then, fuck, okay. Yeah, we're coming. He ended the call and stood abruptly. We need to move. Now! What happened? Wade hit the clubhouse. The world tilted again. Eli grabbed the table ledge. What? 20 minutes ago. Drove past with something in his truck. Graves thinks explosives based on how fast he was moving. They scattered before anything detonated, but the garage is gone. Main building's on fire. Was anyone hurt? Cole took shrapnel. Reapers got burns. Nothing fatal, but it's bad. Mac was already moving, grabbing supplies, checking the gun safe. And here's the problem. Wade didn't run after. He parked on the ridge overlooking the clubhouse, just sitting there watching it burn. Why? Because he wants us to come to him, wants to finish this. Mac pulled a shotgun from the safe and checked the chamber with practiced efficiency. Graves says we're done running, says we end this tonight. What the? All of you are going after him? Yeah, that's stupid. He's expecting that. He's got the high ground, and he's prepared. Mac looked at Eli with something like respect. You're right. It is stupid. But that's how this works. You threaten the club responds. We don't calculate odds. We don't plan strategies. We just hit back harder than we got hit. That's how you get killed. Maybe. Mac handed Eli a heavy jacket. But it's also how you send a message. That we don't back down. That threatening us has consequences. That you can't burn down our home and just walk away. They locked up the cabin and mounted the Road King. The engine roared to life. Mechanical thunder in the silent forest. Mac didn't wait for Eli to get settled before tearing down the dirt road. Ice and snow spraying from the back tire. They hit the main highway doing 80, the winter landscape blurring past in shades of gray. Eli wrapped his arms around Mac's leather cut and tried not to think about what they were riding toward. Tried not to imagine the clubhouse burning, Cole bleeding, Reaper's burns. The smell of gasoline and charred wood. and the particular scent of violence that hung over places where men fought and died. They met up with the others 3 miles from the clubhouse. 7 motorcycles parked in a gas station parking lot, engines idling, exhaust mixing with cigarette smoke in the cold air. The bikers stood in a loose circle, Graves at the center, his face carved from stone and old war trauma. Blood on several cuts, soot staining leather, but alive. All of them alive, for now. Graves looked at Eli, then at Mac. "Kid shouldn't be here, Eva." "Nowhere else safe," Mac said. "Wade's got maps, photos. He knows all our spots." "So we're bringing a 12-year-old to a firefight. You got a better idea?" Graves stared at Eli for a long moment. Whatever he saw there, fear, determination, or just the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd stopped expecting rescue, made him nod slowly. "All right, but he stays back, way back. This goes wrong, Mac. You get him out. Understood?" "Understood." "Morsi, Costin." Cole spoke up, his voice tight with pain. His left arm was wrapped in makeshift bandages, blood seeping through. "Boss, we're outgunned. Wade's got explosives, maybe a rifle. He's dug in on high ground and he's been planning this. We ride up there. We're riding into an ambush." "I know." "So why are we doing it?" "Because if we don't, he wins, destroys our clubhouse, forces us to run, and then he comes after us one by one until everyone who knows what he did is dead." Graves lit a cigarette, his hands steady despite everything. "Only way to end this is to end him, tonight, before he gets organized, before he brings in help." "Help?" Eli asked. "What help?" Graves exchanged glances with the other bikers. "Wade's been operating for 20 years. That doesn't happen without protection. Without people covering for him. Someone in social services. Maybe law enforcement. We don't know who yet, but there's a network. And once Wade makes contact with that network, we're fucked." Bob. The implication spread through the parking lot like spilled gasoline. Wade wasn't just one man. He was connected, protected, part of something larger and darker than anyone had realized. "So what's the plan?" Reaper asked. His face was red with burns, blistered and raw, but his voice was steady. "We split up. Half come at him from the road, obvious approach, get his attention. Other half circle through the forest on foot, come at him from behind. Pincer movement, basic tactics." "Basic gets people killed," Mac said. "You got better?" Silence, because they all knew there wasn't a better plan. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and running on rage instead of strategy. But rage was what they had. Rage and the simple violent certainty that some things were worth dying for. "I'm going with you," Eli said. Every head turned toward him. "Absolutely not," Graves said. "He wants me. I'm what this is about. If I'm there, he'll focus on me. Make mistakes. Mats. You're 12 years old. And I lived with him for 7 months. I know how he thinks, how he moves. What makes him angry?" Eli's voice was shaking but determined. "You need every advantage." "I'm an advantage." Graves studied him with those ice-cold eyes that had seen too much death overseas and learned to calculate acceptable losses. "You understand what you're volunteering for?" "Yeah. You could die." "I could die anyway. At least this way I'm doing something instead of just waiting." The bikers looked at each other in that silent language they'd developed over years of riding together. Some kind of consensus passed between them, unspoken, collective, probably insane. "All right," Graves said finally, "but you stay with me. Don't move unless I tell you. Don't speak unless I ask. You're bait, not a participant. Clear?" "Clear." "Sit." They mounted their bikes. Engines roared in sequence, a mechanical chorus announcing violence. They split into 2 groups, 4 bikes taking the main road with Graves and Eli, 3 cutting through back trails to circle around through the forest. The plan was simple and probably suicidal, but it was a plan. They rode toward the ridge where Wade waited. The burned ruins of the clubhouse appeared first, skeletal remains silhouetted against the winter sky, smoke still rising from collapsed timbers. The garage was completely gone, reduced to a foundation and scattered debris. The main building was partially standing, but flames licked at what remained, consuming history and memory and everything the black vultures had built over decades. Eli stared at the destruction as they passed. This was his fault. Wade had done this because Eli had run to the bikers, because Eli had told them about the abuse, because Eli had existed at all. Graves must have felt him tense because the sergeant-at-arms reached back and squeezed Eli's knee once. Not comfort exactly, just acknowledgement. We're in this together, whatever comes. They turned onto the access road leading up the ridge. Gravel crunched under tires. The Harley's engines echoed off trees like rolling thunder. No stealth, no subtlety. They were announcing their presence, drawing Wade's attention, making themselves targets. Halfway up the ridge, Graves raised his fist. The bike stopped. He killed his engine. The others followed. Sudden silence except for wind in the pines and the distant crackle of the burning clubhouse. "He's up there, Graves said quietly. 300 yards. Probably watching us right now through a scope." "So we're sitting ducks," Cole said. "Yeah, but that's the point. Keep him focused on us while Mac and the others circle behind." They dismounted and took positions behind their bikes. Inadequate cover, but better than nothing. Graves pulled a pistol from inside his cut. Cole did the same despite his wounded arm. Reaper had a hunting knife that looked like it had seen combat. Eli crouched behind Graves' bike, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. The forest was silent, waiting. Even the wind had stopped. Then Wade's voice echoed down from the ridge, amplified by some kind of megaphone or bullhorn. "Graves, I know you're there. Send up the boy and everyone else walks away." Graves didn't respond, just checked his pistol and waited. "I've got enough explosives to level this whole hillside," Wade continued. "And I've got a rifle with a scope. You're outgunned and you know it. So let's be smart about this." Still no response from Graves. The silence itself was a message. We don't negotiate with people who hurt children. "Fine," Wade said. "Let's try this differently." A shot cracked through the air. Something punched into Cole's bike, sparking off metal. The young biker dove sideways with a curse. Another shot. Then 3 more in rapid succession, bullets whining past close enough that Eli felt the displacement of air. "He's not trying to hit us," Reaper said. "Just keeping us pinned." "Waiting for something," Graves agreed. The answer came 60 seconds later, sirens in the distance. Police. Fire department. Wade had called them in. Now, he wasn't just keeping the bikers pinned, he was making sure they'd be here when law enforcement arrived. "Motherfucker," Cole breathed. Graves' expression went colder than Eli had ever seen it. "He's framing us. Burned clubhouse, illegal weapons, shooting at police. He walks away clean while we go to prison. What do? We move. Now. Before cops get here." Graves looked at Eli. "Stay low. Follow me exactly. Don't stop for anything." They abandoned the bikes and moved into the trees, using the forest for cover. Branches whipped at Eli's face. Snow soaked through his jeans. Behind them, the sirens grew louder. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, Wade waited with a rifle and enough rage to level mountains. They'd gone maybe 50 yards when Mac's voice came through on Graves's radio, low and urgent. "Boss, we've got a problem." "What?" "Wade's not alone up here. There's 2 others with him, armed, professional. This is way bigger than one crazy foster father." Graves stopped moving. Eli nearly ran into his back. Around them, the other bikers had frozen, processing this new information. Wade had backup, trained backup, which meant the network Graves had suspected was real, was here, was prepared to protect Wade no matter what he'd done. "Can you ID them?" Graves asked into the radio. Static, then, "Negative, but one's wearing body armor. The other has night vision. These aren't amateurs." The sirens were close now, maybe 2 minutes out. The bikers were trapped between Wade's position above and law enforcement below. Every option led to prison or death. Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a decision forming that he didn't have words for yet. He looked at Graves, this scarred, violent man who'd offered protection to a stranger, who'd put everything on the line for a kid he barely knew, who was about to get arrested or killed because Eli had walked into his clubhouse 7 days ago. "Let me go to him," Eli said. "Absolutely not. Listen." Eli's voice was steady now, calm in a way that surprised him. "Wade wants me. If I go up there, he'll let his guard down. Give your people an opening, and when the cops get here, I'm just a scared foster kid. They won't arrest me. They'll arrest us. Maybe. But at least you'll be alive to get arrested. Graves stared at him. Kid, you don't know what you're asking. Ishkian. Yeah, I do. I'm asking to be bait. Real bait this time. Not hiding behind your bike, but actually walking up there and giving Wade what he wants. He'll kill you. Maybe. But if I don't go, he kills all of you. And then me. So either way, I'm dead. At least this way has a chance. The logic was airtight and terrible. Cole opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Reaper looked away. Even Graves couldn't find a counter-argument that held water. This is the worst plan I've ever heard, the sergeant-at-arms said finally. You got better? Graves almost smiled. No, I don't. He keyed the radio. Mac, the kid's coming up. When he draws their attention, you move. Hard and fast. No hesitation. Boss, it's his choice. Respect it. Eli started walking before he could change his mind. Up the ridge. Through the trees. Toward the place where Wade waited with hired killers and enough hate to burn down the world. Behind him, he heard Graves following at a distance, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough that Wade might not notice. The sirens reached the bottom of the ridge. Doors slammed. Voices shouted commands. The trap was closing. Eli emerged into a small clearing. Wade stood at the far end with two men flanking him, one in tactical gear, one in a sheriff's deputy uniform. The deputy. That was the connection. Someone in law enforcement protecting Wade's operation for 20 years. Wade smiled when he saw Eli. There you are. I was starting to think you'd run. Where would I go? Good question. Wade gestured at the deputy. This is Officer Chen. He's been very helpful over the years, making sure certain reports don't get filed, certain complaints don't get investigated. You'd be surprised how easy it is when you have someone inside the system. The deputy didn't speak, just watched with flat, dead eyes that reminded Eli of sharks he'd seen in nature documentaries. So what now? Eli asked. Now we clean up loose ends, starting with you, then the bikers, then anyone else who saw those files. Wade raised the rifle. Nothing personal, you understand. Eli understood that he was about to die. That Graves and the others were about to die. That Wade would walk away clean because he had protection at every level. That the system designed to protect children had failed so completely that a serial killer had operated for 2 decades without consequence. But he also understood something else. Something Wade had missed in his confidence and planning. Eli wasn't scared anymore. 7 months of beatings had taught him fear. Taught him when to flinch, when to run, when to make himself small. But standing here on this ridge with a rifle pointed at his chest, Eli felt something different, something colder and darker and more dangerous. He felt rage. Do it, Eli said. Wade hesitated. What? Pull the trigger. Kill a 12-year-old in cold blood. Let's see if Officer Chen can cover that up too. Eli... Wade's smile flickered. Because here's what I think. I think you're a coward. I think you've spent 20 years killing children because they're the only people who can't fight back. But now you're facing people who can. And you're terrified. Wade's face went red. You little... The shot came from the forest. Not Wade's rifle. Something bigger. The man in tactical gear went down hard, his chest exploding red against the snow. Then Mac and the others were there, erupting from the tree line with weapons drawn and the kind of focused violence that came from men who'd spent their lives learning to survive by any means necessary. The deputy reached for his service weapon, but Reaper was faster, slamming into him, driving him to the ground. They went down in a tangle of fists and curses, rolling through snow that turned pink with blood. Wade spun toward Eli, the rifle coming up. Their eyes met, and in that fraction of a second, Eli saw something flicker across Wade's face. Not rage, not even fear. Just the sudden, terrible realization that he'd underestimated the kid. That by teaching Eli to survive, he'd created someone who couldn't be controlled anymore. Graves' pistol cracked. Once. Twice. Wade staggered backward, red blooming across his shirt. The rifle fell from hands that suddenly couldn't hold anything. He dropped to his knees in the snow, staring at Eli with eyes going glassy and distant. You were supposed to be easy, Wade whispered. Then he fell forward and didn't move again. The clearing went silent. Eli stood perfectly still, staring at Wade's body, unable to process that it was finally over, that the man who'd terrorized him for 7 months was dead in the snow, that he'd survived, Graves appeared beside him, pistol still drawn. "You good?" Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. The sirens had reached the bottom of the hill. Voices shouted through bullhorns, demanding everyone come out with their hands up. But up here in the clearing, the black vultures stood in a loose circle around the bodies, covered in blood and soot and the evidence of everything they'd done. "We need to move," Max said. "Now, before cops see this." "Too late," Graves said. "They'll find the bodies. Do forensics. This doesn't end clean. So what do we do?" Graves looked at Eli, then at the deputy, who Reaper had zip-tied and was guarding with the same cold efficiency he'd probably learned in combat. Then at Wade's body cooling in the snow. "We tell the truth," Graves said finally. "All of it. The files, the evidence, everything. Let the chips fall where they will." "That means prison," Cole said. "For all of us. Maybe. But it also means Wade's network gets exposed. Means the kids he killed get justice. Means Eli stays safe." Graves holstered his pistol. "That's worth it." The bikers looked at each other. No argument. No negotiation. Just silent acceptance of what came next. They'd made their choice when they decided to protect Eli. Now they'd live with the consequences. Police emerged from the trees, guns drawn, faces showing the shock of discovering a battlefield instead of a simple assault scene. They shouted commands. The bikers raised their hands. Slowly, carefully, they knelt in the snow. But before the cops reached them, Graves looked at Eli one more time. "Whatever happens next, you remember something. You're not alone. You're not broken. And you're sure as hell not easy. Understood?" Eli nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Then the police were there, separating them, cuffing them, reading rights that barely registered through the shock and exhaustion. Eli watched them take Graves away. This dangerous, damaged man who'd somehow become his protector. Watched them load Mac and the others into separate vehicles, and realized that he'd survived Wade only to lose the only family he'd ever really had. A female officer knelt beside him. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Can you tell me what happened here?" Eli looked at the bodies, at the blood in the snow, at the evidence of violence that would take weeks to process and probably never fully make sense to people who'd never needed to understand that sometimes protection looked like murder. "Yeah," he said finally, "I can tell you everything." And somewhere in the darkness, as police lights painted the forest red and blue and the winter wind carried away the last smoke from the burning clubhouse, Eli understood that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of whatever came after you survived the unsurvivable. The interrogation room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the particular desperation of people who'd learned the walls had ears. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow. Eli sat across from Detective Sarah Kovac, 40-something, gray starting in her dark hair, eyes that had seen enough humanity's worst to stop being surprised by new variations. She'd been questioning him for 3 hours. "Let's go through it again," Kovac said, her voice showing the first cracks of exhaustion. "You say Wade Garrison was planning to kill you?" "Yes." "And that he'd killed other children, foster kids in his care?" "Yes." "And that a sheriff's deputy, Officer Chen, was helping him cover it up?" "That's what Wade said, right before Graves shot him." Kovac leaned back in her chair. Outside the room, Eli could hear voices, phones ringing, the machinery of law enforcement trying to process a situation that kept getting bigger and stranger. "Eli, I want to believe you, but you have to understand how this looks. A motorcycle club breaks into a man's house, finds supposedly incriminating files, then kills him and a deputy in what they claim was self-defense. You found the files in Wade's basement. We found documents, yes, but their chain of custody is compromised. They were discovered during an illegal search. Any halfway decent lawyer will get them thrown out." "What about the clothing?" "In the crawl space. My mother's clothing." Something flickered across Kovac's face. "We're processing that. But even if it belongs to Rachel Mercer, it doesn't directly prove Wade killed her. Could have been kept for sentimental reasons. Could have been stored and forgotten." Eli felt cold spreading through his chest. "You don't believe me." "I believe you believe what you're saying, but belief isn't evidence. And right now, I've got 2 dead bodies, 5 bikers in custody, and a story that sounds like it was written by someone trying to justify vigilante murder. So Wade wins. Even dead, he wins." Kovac sighed and rubbed her eyes. That's not what I'm saying. The door opened. Another detective stuck his head in, younger, agitated. Kovac, we've got a problem. I'm in the middle of... It's about Officer Chen, his computer. You need to see this. Kovac stood and looked at Eli. Stay here. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Monday, Mouse. She left. The door locked behind her with a click that sounded final. Eli sat alone in the interrogation room and tried not to think about what was happening in the cells where they were holding Graves and the others. Tried not to imagine the charges being filed, the lawyers being called, the system grinding slowly toward whatever justice looked like when everyone involved had broken laws and nobody's hands were clean. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The fluorescent lights hummed their insect song. Eli's exhaustion was so complete it felt like gravity had increased, pressing him down into the uncomfortable chair. Finally, the door opened again. Kovac entered, but her expression had changed. The professional skepticism was gone, replaced by something harder and angrier. Officer Chen had files, she said without preamble, on his police computer. Incident reports that were never filed, complaints about Wade that disappeared, and communications, emails, text messages, with other people, other officers, social workers, people in the system. Eli's throat felt tight. How many people? We're still counting, but it looks like Wade wasn't just one predator. He was part of a network. People who enabled him, protected him, and in some cases participated. Kovac sat down heavily. This is going to destroy careers. Maybe bring down the entire county social services department. Good. She looked at him sharply. You understand what this means? Everyone involved will lawyer up. They'll fight to suppress evidence, discredit witnesses, muddy the waters. This will take years to prosecute, and there's no guarantee we'll get convictions. What about Graves? The others? SSTMROC Graves. That's complicated. They killed 2 people. Yes, one was a corrupt cop and the other was a serial killer, but the law doesn't care about moral justifications. Self-defense claims are hard to prove when you actively sought out the confrontation. So they go to prison. Maybe, unless we can make a deal. Their testimony about Wade's network in exchange for reduced charges. Kovac leaned forward. But that only works if they cooperate. And right now, Graves isn't talking. None of them are. They lawyered up immediately. Smart. Smart, Kovac agreed, but also frustrating as hell. Because without their statements corroborating yours, we're back to compromised evidence and questionable chain of custody. Eli stared at the table. The metal surface was scarred with old scratches, graffiti carved by previous occupants of this chair. Someone had etched innocent deep into the steel. The irony wasn't lost. Can I see him? Eli asked. Graves. No, he's being held pending arraignment. No visitors except his lawyer. Then let me talk to his lawyer. Kovac studied him. Why? Because Graves protected me when nobody else would. Because he went to war for a kid he barely knew. And because if he's going to prison for that, I need him to know it wasn't for nothing. Something in Kovac's expression softened slightly. I'll see what I can do, Chas. 2 hours later, Eli sat in a different room, smaller, private, with a table bolted to the floor and a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. The door opened and a woman entered. Late 30s, expensive suit, briefcase that probably cost more than Wade's truck. She had the look of someone who'd learned to navigate systems by understanding exactly which rules could be bent and which couldn't. I'm Rebecca Torres, she said, sitting across from Eli. I represent Graves, and the other members of the Black Vulture's MC Detective Kovac said you wanted to talk. Is he okay? Graves? He's in a holding cell, unharmed, but facing serious charges. Murder 2, possibly murder 1, depending how aggressive the DA wants to be. Conspiracy. Weapons violations. The list is extensive. But it was self-defense. Self-defense requires an imminent threat. Graves and his crew rode up that ridge armed and looking for confrontation. That's not self-defense. That's premeditated retaliation. Torres pulled out a legal pad. Which is why we need to build a different narrative. One where they were protecting you from an active threat. Where Wade had already committed violence and was planning more. Where law enforcement had failed to act. That's all true. Truth and provable in court are different things. She clicked her pen. I need you to walk me through everything, start to finish. Every beating, every threat, every moment that made you fear for your life. Because that's how we establish Wade as the aggressor and the bikers as reluctant protectors. So Eli told her everything. The basement, the bruises, the way Wade's voice went flat before violence, the 7 months of careful terror, the moment he'd walked into the clubhouse and asked for work because it felt safer than going home, the way Graves had looked at him and immediately understood. Torres took notes in shorthand, occasionally stopping him to clarify details. When he finished, she set down her pen. This is good. Strong narrative. Sympathetic victim. Clear pattern of abuse. System failure at multiple levels. But here's the problem. None of this directly proves Wade was planning to kill you the night Graves shot him. We need something more immediate. Something that shows lethal force was the only option. The explosives. Wade had explosives, which he'd already used on the clubhouse. By the time Graves confronted him, that threat was past tense. Torres leaned forward. I'm not saying Graves was wrong. I'm saying proving he was legally justified is going to be nearly impossible. So we need to pivot. Make this about Wade's broader crimes, about the network protecting him, about systematic corruption that made vigilante action the only recourse. Will that work? Maybe, if we can get the prosecution to see that putting these bikers on trial means exposing how badly the system failed. How many officials were complicit? How many children died because people looked the other way? She closed her legal pad. But it's going to take time, months probably, maybe years. And in the meantime, your life is evidence. You'll be interviewed, deposed, possibly required to testify in multiple proceedings. Are you prepared for that? Eli thought about what the alternative looked like. Going back into foster care. Another placement. Another temporary home with temporary people. Trying to rebuild a life while knowing the men who'd protected him were in prison. Yeah, he said. I'm prepared. Torres studied him with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating an asset. How old are you? 12. You don't act 12. Oh. 7 months with Wade aged me. She almost smiled. I imagine it did. She stood and gathered her materials. I'll be in touch. In the meantime, social services is placing you in emergency care again. Different group home, different part of this county. Detective Kovac says they're being extra careful this time. Yeah, I bet they are. After Torres left, Kovac returned with a familiar face. Margaret Chen, the social worker who'd first removed Eli from Wade's house. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. New lines around her eyes, gray roots showing in her black hair, the shell-shocked expression of someone whose professional world had just imploded. Eli, she said quietly, I'm sorry for all of it, for placing you with Wade, for not seeing what was happening, for failing you and all the other kids in his care. How many? Eli asked. Total. How many kids went through Wade's house? Margaret's hands trembled as she opened a folder. 19 placements over 22 years. We're trying to locate all of them. Most are alive, traumatized, angry, but alive. 3 are confirmed deceased, the missing persons cases Wade kept files on. And there are 4 others we can't find. No death certificates, but no contact information either. They just disappeared from the system. 7 dead, maybe. We don't know that. Yeah, you do. You just don't want to say it. Eli's voice was flat, emotionless. Wade kept trophies. Graves found them. You'll find them too once you process the evidence, and then you'll know for sure. Margaret closed the folder and pressed her hands against her eyes. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I thought I was good at it. Thought I could spot the warning signs. But Wade fooled me. Fooled all of us. That's what predators do. They're good at it. How are you so calm? After everything? Eli looked at her, this exhausted woman who probably meant well but existed in a system designed to process trauma rather than prevent it. I'm not calm. I'm just too tired to be anything else. The new group home was 40 miles from Ashford, run by a couple named David and Linda Reeves, who specialized in crisis placements. Their house was newer than Patricia's, cleaner, with actual security measures, cameras, locked doors, a panic button system. The kind of place you built after learning that sometimes the danger came from inside the system rather than outside it. Linda showed Eli to his room, private this time, no roommates. The walls were painted neutral beige. The bed had a new mattress still wrapped in plastic. A window looked out on suburban streets where normal families lived normal lives. "You'll be safe here," Linda said. "I promise." Eli didn't respond. He'd heard that promise before. Eli didn't. The days developed their own rhythm. Wake, eat, attend the new school where nobody knew his story yet. Return to the group home. Homework, dinner. Sleep that came in fragmented pieces, interrupted by dreams of basements and burning clubhouses, and Wade's eyes going glassy in the snow. Detective Kovac called regularly with updates. The investigation was expanding, more officials implicated, more evidence uncovered. The district attorney was building what she called the case of the decade. Corruption charges against 6 people, murder charges against Wade posthumously, an ongoing review of every foster placement in the county for the past 20 years. But no updates about Graves and the others. They remained in custody, bail denied, awaiting trial on charges that could mean life sentences. 3 weeks after the night on the ridge, Rebecca Torres called Eli directly. "I need you to come to the jail," she said without preamble. "Graves wants to see you." "I thought visitors weren't allowed." "They're not. But I pulled strings. You've got 20 minutes tomorrow afternoon. Don't be late." The county jail was a concrete block building that looked exactly like what it was, a holding pen for people society had temporarily given up on. Eli went through security, emptied his pockets, endured the metal detector and the board guard's questions. Torres met him on the other side. "Before we go in, understand something," she said. "Graves is not doing well. Jail is hard on veterans with PTSD, and he's been refusing medication." "Why?" Because he doesn't trust the system to not sedate him into compliance, and because some part of him thinks he deserves to suffer for what he did." They walked through corridors painted institutional green, past cells where men sat or paced or stared at nothing. The sounds were the worst, voices echoing, metal doors clanging, the white noise of desperation and rage barely contained. Graves waited in a visitation room. He sat at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his already pale skin look corpse gray. The ice-cold eyes Eli remembered were duller now, exhausted, but they sparked with something when he saw the boy. "Hey, kid." "Hey." Torres positioned herself by the door. Torres, giving them privacy while maintaining attorney-client observation. The guard outside watched through the window with flat professional disinterest. Eli sat across from Graves and tried to find words for what he needed to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry" felt wrong. Nothing captured the complicated knot of gratitude and guilt sitting in his chest. "You look terrible, Tita," Eli said finally. Graves almost smiled. "Yeah, jail's not great for the complexion." "Torres says you're refusing medication." "Torres talks too much." "She's trying to help." "I know." Graves shifted in his seat, the cuffs clinking against the metal table. "How you holding up? New placement okay?" "It's fine. Safe. Linda and David are professional." "But not family." "No, not family." Silence settled between them, heavy, loaded with everything they couldn't say in a monitored room with limited time. Eli could see the toll jail was taking. The lines around Graves' eyes had deepened. His hands showed tremors he was trying to hide. The man who'd faced down Wade without flinching was being slowly dismantled by concrete walls and fluorescent lights. "I talked to Torres," Eli said, "about the case. She thinks you might get a deal, reduce charges in exchange for testimony about the network." "Maybe. You should take it, whatever they offer." "You saved my life. You shouldn't spend yours in prison for that." Graves looked at him for a long moment. "You know why I helped you?" "You said it was because nobody helped you when you were my age. That's part of it. But there's more." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "I spent 3 tours overseas doing things I can't talk about. Necessary things, probably. But they left marks. And when I got home, I didn't know how to exist in a world where violence wasn't the answer to every problem. So I drifted, found the club, found men who understood that some of us are too broken to fit normal lives." "You're not broken." Yeah, I am. We all are. That's why we found each other. He tapped the table with one cuffed hand. But then you showed up. This kid covered in bruises asking for work like it was the most normal thing in the world. And suddenly I had a purpose that wasn't just surviving. I could protect something. Could use all that violence and damage for something good. I didn't mean to. I know. That's the point. You didn't ask for rescue. You just needed help. And helping you gave me something I haven't had since I left the Marines. A mission. Something worth fighting for. Eli's throat felt too tight. Torres says the trial could take a year. Maybe longer. Probably. And even with a deal, you might still do time. Yeah. That's not fair. Graves smiled. Actually smiled. Tired and dark, but genuine. Kid, life's not fair. You learned that 7 months ago. I learned it 30 years ago. But sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you find people worth going to war for. And that makes all the other bullshit bearable. The guard knocked on the window. 5 minutes. Torres straightened from the wall, preparing to end the visit. I need you to promise me something, Graves said quickly. Whatever happens to me, to the club. You keep going. You finish school. You build a life. You don't let Wade win by letting his damage define you. How am I supposed to do that? Same way I did. You find something worth fighting for, and you protect it with everything you have. He stood, the cuffs clinking. You're stronger than you think, tougher than you should have to be, but that strength is yours now. Use it. Miki. The guard opened the door. Time was up. Eli stood on shaking legs. I'll come back, he said. I know, but if you don't, that's okay too. You've got a life to build. Don't put it on hold for me. Torres guided Eli out before he could respond. The door locked behind them with a sound like finality. They walked back through the green corridors, past the cells, through security that felt like passing between worlds. Outside, the winter sun was too bright after the jail's fluorescent gloom. Eli stood on the concrete steps and tried to breathe through the tightness in his chest. He's not doing well, Torres said quietly. Jail is killing him slowly. If we can't get bail or a quick trial, I'm worried about what happens. Can you do anything? I'm trying, but the prosecution sees him as a flight risk, and the judge is under pressure to appear tough on motorcycle gang violence. She pulled out her car keys. I'll keep pushing. She bumped. But you need to prepare for the possibility that Graves might be in custody for a long time. Eli nodded without speaking. Because what else could he do? The system had already failed him once by placing him with Wade. Now it was failing the men who'd protected him from Wade. And there was no appeals process for that kind of injustice. Torres drove him back to the group home. Linda was waiting on the porch, her professional smile firmly in place. Eli thanked Torres and went inside to the beige walls and new mattress and the suffocating safety of a system that had learned nothing except how to be more careful about its paperwork. That night, lying in bed, Eli's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Is this Eli Mercer? A man's voice. Older. Careful. Who's asking? Hoopa. My name is Thomas Garrett. I was one of Wade Garrison's foster kids. 20 years ago, before you were born. Eli sat up, suddenly wide awake. How did you get this number? Detective Kovac is trying to contact all of Wade's previous placements. She gave me yours. Said you might want to talk to someone who understood. Understood what? What it's like to survive him, and what comes after. Silence on the line. Outside, suburban streets were quiet. Normal families sleeping normal sleep. But here in the darkness, Eli held a phone connected to someone who'd walked his same path 20 years earlier. How bad was it? Eli asked. For you? Bad enough that I spent the next 2 decades in therapy learning how to exist without waiting for the next beating. Bad enough that I still check locks 3 times before bed. Bad enough that I can't let anyone touch me without flinching. Thomas's voice was steady, clinical, like he was discussing someone else's trauma. But I survived, and you will too. I don't know if I can. Yeah, you do. You already proved it. You got out. You found help. You stayed alive when Wade wanted you dead. That's not luck. That's strength. What if the strength runs out? It doesn't. It just changes shape. Become something you carry instead of something you use. But it's always there. They talked for another hour. Thomas told him about the decades after Wade, the failed relationships and the jobs he couldn't keep, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust people again, but also about the good things. The therapist who finally helped, the partner who waited patiently for him to heal, the career he'd built working with other trauma survivors. Wade took a lot from us, Thomas said. But he didn't take everything. And the parts he left behind, those parts are stronger than he ever was. After they hung up, Eli sat in the darkness and tried to believe that. Tried to imagine a future where he wasn't defined by basements and bruises and 7 months of terror, where he could be something other than a damaged kid who'd survived the unsurvivable. The phone buzzed again. Different number. This one he recognized. Text from Mac. "Heard you saw Graves. How is he?" Eli stared at the message. Mac was also in custody, also facing charges, also trapped by a system that couldn't distinguish between monsters and the men who fought them. But he was asking about Graves, checking on his brother. Eli typed back, "Not good. Jail's hard on him." 3 dots appeared, then, "Yeah, hard on all of us, but we've been through worse. We'll get through this." How? Same way we always do. One day at a time, one fight at a time, and we remember what we're fighting for. Another message. "That's you, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. You're what we're fighting for." Eli felt something crack in his chest. He typed, "I'm sorry. This is all my fault." The response came immediately. "Bullshit. This is Wade's fault, and the system's fault, and every adult who looked the other way while he destroyed kids. You're just the one who survived long enough to tell the story. Don't apologize for that." Eli wanted to respond but didn't know what to say. How do you thank someone for protecting you when that protection had destroyed their life? How do you carry the weight of being worth saving? Before he could figure it out, another text appeared. Different number. Unknown. "You should stop talking to the bikers. They're dangerous criminals who killed 2 men, including a police officer. You don't want to be associated with that." Eli stared at the message. The area code was local. Montana. Someone who knew about the case. Someone who knew Eli was still in contact with the club. Someone from Wade's network. His hands started shaking. He called Torres immediately. "Someone's threatening me," he said when she answered. "What? Who?" He read her the message, heard her curse quietly on the other end. "That's witness intimidation. Send me a screenshot. I'm calling Kovac right now." "Torres, they know my number. They know I'm still talking to the club. They're watching me." I know. Listen to me. Don't respond. Don't engage. Keep your phone on you at all times. If you see anything suspicious, you call 911 immediately. Understood?" "What?" "Yeah, book the guts." "I'm serious, Eli. Wade's network is bigger than we thought, and they're getting desperate, which makes them dangerous." After she hung up, Eli sat in his room and listened to the group home settling around him. Linda and David sleeping down the hall. Other kids in other rooms, all of them damaged in different ways, all of them trying to survive in a world that had already broken them once. And somewhere out there, people from Wade's network were watching, waiting, planning their next move. The phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. "Last warning, stop talking, stop testifying, or the bikers aren't the only ones who'll end up in graves." Eli's hands shook so hard he nearly dropped the phone. He took a screenshot and sent it to Torres, then Kovac, then Linda just to have a paper trail. Because if something happened to him, at least people would know why. He didn't sleep that night. Just sat in bed with his back against the wall, watching the door, listening to every sound. By morning, he'd made a decision. He couldn't wait for the system to protect him. Couldn't trust that courts and lawyers and proper procedures would move fast enough to keep him alive. Because Wade's network was still out there, still operating, still desperate to silence the one witness who could expose them all. Which meant Eli needed to do what Graves had taught him. He needed to fight back. Detective Kovac arrived at the group home 40 minutes after Eli sent her the screenshots. She came with 2 uniformed officers and an expression that suggested she'd stopped being surprised by how deep this corruption went, but hadn't stopped being angry about it. Linda let them into the living room where Eli sat on the couch, his phone clutched in both hands like evidence or a weapon. The texts glowed on the screen, threats made digital, permanent, actionable if the system chose to act. We traced the number, Kovac said, sitting across from him. Burner phone. Purchased cash 3 days ago at a convenience store in Billings. No cameras, no way to identify the buyer. So you can't find them. Not through the phone, but we're cross-referencing everyone connected to Wade's network. Officers who worked with Chen, social workers who processed Wade's placements, anyone who had access to case files and might have seen your contact information. She pulled out a notebook. In the meantime, we're putting protection on this house. Plainclothes officer outside 24/7, and I need you to stop contacting the bikers. Eli's hands tightened on his phone. Why? Because whoever sent those texts is right about one thing. Your association with the Black Vultures makes you a target. They killed Wade. They exposed the network. And anyone still operating inside that network sees them as the primary threat, which makes anyone connected to them secondary targets. So I'm supposed to abandon them while they're in jail because they protected me. I'm asking you to stay alive, Kovac said flatly, which is hard to do when people with something to lose are threatening you in writing. Linda spoke up from the doorway. Maybe Eli should be moved. Different facility, different county, somewhere further from all of this. We're considering that, Kovac agreed. But moving him means pulling him from school again. New placement. New caseworker. More disruption to a life that's already been disrupted enough. Better disrupted than dead, Linda said. They discussed him like he wasn't there, talking over his head, making decisions about his safety that didn't include his input. Eli felt something cold and hard forming in his chest, the same feeling he'd had standing on that ridge with Wade's rifle pointed at him. The moment when fear transformed into something more useful. I want to testify, he said. The conversation stopped. Kovac looked at him. What? At the trial. Wherever. Whenever. I want to testify about everything Wade did, everything I saw. Put it on record so the network can't bury it. Eli, that's months away. Maybe a year. And testifying will make you an even bigger target. I'm already a target. These texts prove it. So either I hide for the next year waiting for someone to find me, or I go on offense. Make myself so public, so documented, that killing me would only prove everything I'm saying. Kovac exchanged glances with the uniformed officers. That's not how witness protection works. I'm not asking for witness protection. I'm asking to fight back. Eli set his phone on the coffee table. Wade spent 20 years operating because everyone who knew stayed quiet. Either they were part of it or too scared to speak up. I'm done being scared, and I'm definitely done staying quiet. Something shifted in Kovac's expression, respect maybe, or recognition. You're 12 years old. Yeah, and I've survived things most adults can't imagine, so don't tell me I'm too young to decide how to protect myself. Linda moved from the doorway, sitting beside Eli on the couch. Sweetheart, I understand wanting to be brave, but bravery doesn't mean putting yourself in unnecessary danger. What? Nothing about this is unnecessary, Eli interrupted. Graves and the others are in jail because they stood between me and Wade. Now people from Wade's network are threatening me. If I back down, hide, stop talking, then Wade wins. Even dead, he wins. And I can't let that happen. The room fell silent except for the radiator ticking and the sounds of other kids moving through the house upstairs. Outside, winter darkness had fallen early, turning the suburban streets into corridors of shadow broken by streetlights. Kovac closed her notebook. I'll talk to the district attorney, see if we can arrange a deposition. Get your testimony on record earlier than the trial, but I can't promise anything. That's all I'm asking. A chance. After the police left, Linda made Eli hot chocolate and sat with him at the kitchen table. David had gone to check on the other kids, leaving them alone in the yellow light of the overhead fixture. You know what you're doing is dangerous, Linda said quietly. Yeah. And you're doing it anyway. Yeah. She sipped her own chocolate, studying him over the rim of her mug. Why? What makes it worth the risk? Eli thought about Graves in that orange jumpsuit, exhausted and damaged, but still asking how Eli was holding up. Thought about Mac teaching him about carburetors with patient hands. Thought about Tina building him sandwiches and the way the clubhouse had felt like the first place in his life that might actually be safe. Biko! 'Cause they were my family, he said finally. For like a week, maybe less. But they were real. They protected me when nobody else would, and now they're paying for that. So yeah, it's dangerous. But abandoning them would be worse. Linda nodded slowly. That's very loyal and very mature. But Eli, you need to understand something. Family isn't always about blood or even about who raised you. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them. And from what I've seen, those bikers showed up. But so has Detective Kovac, so has Rebecca Torres, so have David and I, even if we're just temporary. It's not the same. No, Linda agreed. It's not, because we're working inside a system that failed you, and they operated outside it. But that doesn't make our care less real. It just makes it more complicated. Eli finished his chocolate without responding, because she was right, and he knew it. The system had people trying to help. Margaret Chen drowning in guilt, Kovac working overtime to expose the network, Torres fighting impossible legal battles, all of them doing what they could within constraints they hadn't created. But the bikers had chosen him without constraints, had looked at a scared kid covered in bruises and decided he was worth going to war for. And that choice, reckless, illegal, dangerous, had mattered in ways the system's careful procedures never could. That night, Eli lay in bed and stared at his phone. The threatening texts had stopped after Kovac's visit, but the silence felt more ominous than the messages. Like whoever was watching had decided threats weren't working and was moving to the next stage of whatever plan they'd developed. His phone buzzed. Not a text this time, a call. Torres. Turn on the news, she said without preamble. Channel 7. Now, Shad. Eli grabbed the remote and switched on the small TV in his room. The late news was showing footage of the county courthouse. Yellow crime scene tape, police vehicles, and a reporter standing in front of the building explaining that someone had broken into the district attorney's office overnight and stolen files related to the Wade Garrison case. They took everything, Torres said. Physical evidence, digital backups, witness statements, all the documentation we'd been building. Eli felt cold spreading through his chest. How is that possible? That's a courthouse. There's security secure? Yeah, there is. Which means whoever did this had access, badges, codes, inside knowledge. Her voice was tight with controlled rage. This wasn't some random break-in. This was surgical. They knew exactly what to take and where it was stored. So the case is gone. Not gone, but severely compromised. We've got copies of copies, but chain of custody is destroyed. Any defense attorney will argue the evidence has been tampered with, that we can't prove what's authentic. She paused. Eli, this means the charges against Graves and the others might get dropped. Not because they're innocent, but because the prosecution's case against the network just fell apart. And without that context, the killings look like vigilante murder instead of desperate protection. They'll go to prison. Maybe. Probably. Unless we can rebuild the case fast enough to provide context. But that takes time we don't have. Arraignment is in 3 days. If the DA can't show compelling evidence of the broader conspiracy, the judge will likely move forward with murder charges and deny bail again. Eli sat on the edge of his bed. The TV is still showing footage of the courthouse. What do? We fight. We find other evidence. We get testimony from other survivors. We make this case so public that burying it becomes impossible. Torres's voice softened slightly. But Eli, I need you to be realistic. The system is broken. Wade's network is still operating, and the people protecting that network have resources we can't match. So they win. Maybe. Or maybe we find a way to make winning cost them more than they're willing to pay. After she hung up, Eli sat in the darkness and tried to think like Graves. What would the sergeant-at-arms do if he were here? How would someone trained in combat and survival approach a situation where all the conventional options had been eliminated? The answer came slow but certain. You changed the battlefield. Eli picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call was to Thomas Garrett, the survivor who'd reached out weeks ago. Thomas answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Eli, it's late. I need help, and I need you to contact the other survivors, everyone who went through Wade's house and lived. I need them to go public. Silence on the line. Then, what are you talking about? On the evidence got stolen. The case is falling apart. which means the only thing that can save it is testimony, multiple voices all telling the same story, making it impossible to dismiss as one traumatized kid making things up. Eli, most of us have spent years trying to forget Wade existed. You're asking people to relive their worst trauma in public. I know. And I wouldn't ask if there was another option, but there isn't. Eli's hands were shaking, but his voice stayed steady. Wade's network is still operating, still protecting itself. And unless we expose them completely, more kids are going to end up like we did. Or worse. Another long silence. Then Thomas exhaled slowly. I'll make calls, can't promise anyone will agree, but I'll try. That's all I'm asking. The second call was to Margaret Chen. She answered immediately, like she'd been waiting for bad news. I heard about the courthouse, Eli said. I need access to your files. Everything you have on Wade's previous placements. Eli, those files are confidential. Margaret, someone inside the system is protecting Wade's network. Someone with access to evidence and the power to make it disappear. Which means normal channels can't be trusted. So either you help me build a case outside those channels, or more kids die while we wait for the system to fix itself. He heard her breathing on the other end, heard the war happening inside her head between procedure and conscience. Finally, if I do this, I lose my job. Maybe my license. Yeah, probably. And you're asking anyway. Because you owe me. You owed me the day you placed me with Wade. And you owe every other kid who came through his house while you and the system looked the other way. The words were harsh, brutal even, but they were true, and Margaret knew it. I'll send you digital copies, she said quietly, encrypted. But Eli, this stays between us. If anyone asks, you got these through official channels. Understood. The third call was to Mac. It went to voicemail. He wasn't allowed phone access from custody, but Eli left a message anyway. It's me. I know you can't call back, but I need you to know I'm fighting. For you, for Graves, for all of it. And I'm not stopping until everyone knows what Wade did and who protected him. So hold on. Just a little longer, because we're not done yet. By morning, Eli had received files from Margaret, 19 placements, complete case histories, complaint logs that had been buried or dismissed. He also had contact information for 12 survivors, including Thomas. And he had a plan that was probably insane, but felt more solid than waiting for the system to save him. He called Detective Kovac. I want to hold a press conference, he said. Absolutely not. Bush. Wade's network stole the evidence because they're scared, because they know if this story goes public, they're finished. So let's make it public. I'll tell my story. Other survivors will tell theirs. We'll make it impossible to ignore. Eli, that makes you a target. I'm already a target. These texts proved it. So either I hide and let them come for me in the dark, or I stand in the light and make them come at me where everyone can see. Wookie. Kovac was silent for a long moment. You've been talking to the bikers, haven't you? This sounds like something Graves would say. Maybe, but that doesn't make it wrong. No, she admitted. It doesn't, but it does make it dangerous. And my job is to keep you safe, not turn you into bait. Then your job is impossible. Because I stopped being safe the day I got placed with Wade. And I'll never be safe until his network is exposed and destroyed. So help me do this properly, or I'll do it alone. He heard her exhale, frustrated, angry, but also something like respect. You're the most stubborn 12-year-old I've ever met. 7 months with Wade taught me stubbornness is survival. 2 days later, they held the press conference in a community center 30 miles from Ashford. Kovac had wanted somewhere public, somewhere with security, somewhere that made attacking Eli require going through cameras and witnesses and uniformed officers stationed at every exit. The room filled slowly. Reporters from local news stations, bloggers covering Montana crime, advocates for foster care reform who'd heard about the case. Eli sat at a table in front with Kovac on one side and Torres on the other. Behind him, arranged in chairs like a jury of ghosts, sat 7 survivors of Wade's house. Thomas was there. So were others, now in their 20s and 30s, carrying scars that didn't show on skin, but lived in the careful way they held themselves. The cameras started rolling. Kovac made a brief statement about the investigation, about the stolen evidence, about the ongoing effort to expose corruption in the foster care system. Then she turned to Eli. Eli has something he wants to say. Eli looked at the cameras, looked at the reporters with their notebooks and recorders, looked at the survivors behind him who'd agreed to sit here and relive their worst memories because one 12-year-old kid had asked them to. "My name is Eli Mercer," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm 12 years old, and 7 months ago, I was placed with a foster father named Wade Garrison, who spent the next half year beating me, starving me, and locking me in a basement when I didn't follow his rules perfectly. He told them everything. The bruises, the fear, the moment he'd walked into a biker clubhouse because it felt safer than going home, the way Graves had looked at him and immediately understood. The files they'd found, Wade's network, the stolen evidence. Wade Garrison killed my mother 12 years ago, Eli continued, and then he spent the next decade killing other children while people in the system protected him. Social workers who ignored complaints, police officers who buried reports, officials who valued reputation over children's lives. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. The men who protected me are in jail right now. They're facing murder charges because they stood between me and Wade, because they did what the system wouldn't do. And yeah, they're criminals. They've done bad things. But they're also the reason I'm alive to tell you this story." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. Wade's network is still out there, still operating, still threatening anyone who tries to expose them. They stole evidence from a courthouse. They're sending threatening messages to witnesses. They're doing everything they can to bury this story. But I'm not going to let them. Neither are the people behind me. We're survivors, and we're done staying quiet. One by one, the other survivors spoke. Thomas told about beatings that left him unable to sit for days. A woman named Claire described being locked in a closet for 18 hours as punishment for breaking a dish. A man named Marcus talked about watching Wade drag another foster kid down to the basement and hearing screams that lasted until morning. By the time they finished, several reporters were crying. One had stopped taking notes and was just listening with the kind of horror that came from realizing evil didn't just exist in movies. The press conference ended. The cameras stopped rolling, and Eli sat at that table knowing he'd just painted a target on himself and everyone who'd spoken, but also knowing that the target had been there anyway. Invisible, but deadly. At least now it was visible. At least now people were watching. Kovac drove him back to the group home in tense silence. Finally, she said, "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest." Maybe both. Yeah, maybe. She pulled into the driveway. "The DA called during your testimony. She's reopening the investigation based on what you and the others said, bringing in federal prosecutors. This is bigger than county corruption now." "What about Graves? The others?" "Still in custody. But Torres thinks she can argue for bail based on community support and the context you just provided. Judge might be willing to reconsider given the new information." "Might?" "It's the best we've got." That night, the news aired clips from the press conference. Eli's face appeared on television, young, defiant, damaged, but not broken. The story went regional, then viral. Social media exploded with outrage and support, and the inevitable conspiracy theories. By morning, 3 major news networks wanted interviews. Child advocacy groups were demanding federal investigations. And someone had started a crowdfunding campaign to pay for the bikers' legal defense that raised $40,000 in 6 hours. But also the threats started again. Not texts this time. Emails to the group home, calls to Kovac's office, anonymous messages posted on news articles. Most were vague warnings. Some were specific descriptions of what would happen to Eli if he didn't shut up. Torres called on the 3rd day. The judge granted bail for all of them. Graves, Mack, Cole, Reaper, everyone. They're being released this afternoon. Eli felt something unlock in his chest. Why? What changed? Public pressure. The press conference made it politically impossible to keep them locked up without trial. And the federal prosecutors backing the investigation means the judge has cover to appear lenient. She paused. But Eli, bail conditions are strict. They can't leave the county, can't contact each other except through legal counsel. and they're required to surrender their weapons and stay away from any remaining clubhouse property. But they're out. Yeah, they're out. Eli was waiting outside the county jail when they released Graves. The sergeant-at-arms emerged into winter sunlight looking thinner, paler, older than when he'd gone in. He stopped when he saw Eli standing by Torres's car, his expression going through several emotions too fast to track. Then he crossed the parking lot and pulled Eli into a hug that felt like armor and safety, and the particular fierceness of men who'd learned to protect because nobody had protected them. "You stupid, brave kid," Graves said quietly. "You went on television." "Had to. Evidence got stolen." "I heard." Graves pulled back, his hands on Eli's shoulders. "You know what you did, right? You made yourself the biggest target in Montana." "Yeah, but I also made it impossible for them to kill me quietly. Now, if something happens, everyone knows why." "That's not protection. That's suicide with publicity." "Maybe, but it's also the only move we had left." Graves stared at him for a long moment, then smiled, actually smiled, tired and dark, but genuine. "You learned that from me, didn't you? The tactical thinking. You taught me a lot in a week." "Yeah, I guess I did." They met the others at Tina's diner, the one place in Ashford that felt neutral, safe, like home might feel if home was chrome and vinyl and the smell of coffee. Tina had kept the place open late, locking the doors behind them, giving them privacy. The bikers sat in a booth that was too small for all of them, compressed together, their leather cuts showing wear from weeks in custody. Eli sat across from them with Torres and Kovac flanking him like bodyguards or witnesses. Tina brought food without asking, eggs, bacon, toast, the kind of breakfast that felt like celebration and mourning combined. "So," Max said finally, lighting a cigarette despite the no smoking sign. "What now?" "Trial," Torres said. "Federal prosecutors are building a case against 12 people in Wade's network. County officials, social workers, 2 more deputies. It's going to be extensive. Months of testimony, probably multiple trials." "And us?" Reaper asked. "Your case is separate but connected. Self-defense claim backed by evidence of systematic abuse and corruption. With Eli's testimony and the other survivors, we have a strong narrative. But it's still a murder charge. Still serious." "How serious?" Cole leaned forward, his wounded arm still bandaged. "Worst case, 10 to 15 years. Best case, time served and probation." The bikers absorbed this in silence. A decade in prison for protecting a kid the system had abandoned. The unfairness was so profound it became almost abstract. "I'll testify," Eli said, "at all the trials. I'll tell them everything. Wade, the beatings, the network. Make them understand you didn't have a choice." "Kid," Graves started. "No, listen. You went to war for me. Now I go to war for you. That's how family works, right? You taught me that." Something shifted in the booth. The bikers looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that happen without words. Finally, Graves nodded. "All right. We fight. Together. Whatever comes." The trials took 9 months. Federal prosecutors went first, systematically dismantling Wade's network. Officer Chen's partner flipped and testified to decades of buried complaints. A social worker broke down crying on the stand, describing how she'd been pressured to ignore bruises and falsify reports. Margaret Chen testified about systemic failures and her own complicity, her voice steady even as her career burned around her. The verdicts came slow but decisive. Convictions across the board, prison sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. The county social services department was placed under federal oversight. 4 officials resigned. The entire foster care system in western Montana underwent mandatory reform. But those victories felt hollow when the Black Vultures trial started. The courtroom was packed. Supporters wearing leather, survivors from Wade's house, reporters documenting every moment. The prosecution painted the bikers as violent criminals who'd taken the law into their own hands. The defense countered with context, with evidence of systematic failure, with Eli's testimony about 7 months of terror and the men who'd finally said enough. Eli sat on the witness stand for 6 hours over 2 days. He described every beating in clinical detail, showed scars that hadn't fully healed, explained why he'd trusted bikers over police, made the jury understand that sometimes the monsters wear respectable faces and the heroes wear leather cuts. The prosecution tried to shake him, suggested he'd been coached, implied the bikers had manipulated a traumatized child. But Eli held steady, his voice never wavering, his story never changing, because it was true. And truth, he'd learned, had a weight that lies couldn't match. When Graves took the stand, he was calm, controlled, utterly honest. Did I kill Wade Garrison? Yes. Would I do it again? Yes. Because that man was a predator who'd been operating for 20 years while the system looked the other way. And when he came after Eli, someone had to stop him. So I did. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Eli sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Torres, unable to eat, unable to sleep, just waiting while 12 strangers decided if protection looked like justice or murder. The other bikers waited in separate areas. Bail conditions prevented them from gathering. But Eli felt their presence like gravity, like the pull of found family that didn't break just because court said it should. The jury returned on a Thursday afternoon. Eli sat in the front row while the foreman read the verdict. Not guilty. On all charges. Self-defense. Justified force. Protection of a minor from imminent threat. The words blurred together through tears. Eli didn't realize he was crying. Behind him, the courtroom erupted, cheers from supporters, angry shouts from Wade's family, the gavel banging for order. But Eli just stared at Graves, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed, shoulders shaking with something that might have been relief or breakdown or both. When they let people approach after, Eli crossed to the defense table. Graves looked up, his ice-cold eyes wet for the first time since Eli had known him. "It's over," Eli said. "Yeah, it is. What happens now?" Graves stood slowly like a man who'd been carrying weight for so long he'd forgotten what level ground felt like. "Now we rebuild. The clubhouse. The lives. Figure out what comes after surviving. Together? Yeah, kid, together. Just..." The system took 3 more months to process Eli's permanent placement. During that time, he stayed with Linda and David, attending therapy 3 times a week, processing trauma that would probably take years to fully understand. But he also visited the clubhouse, or what was being rebuilt from the ashes. The bikers worked together in the winter cold, raising walls, restoring the garage, creating something new from the ruins of what Wade had destroyed. Eli helped when he could, handed tools to Mac, held boards while Cole hammered, swept debris under Tina's watchful supervision. And slowly, the place started looking like home again. The final custody hearing happened on a Tuesday in March. Spring was trying to happen. Snow melting, mud everywhere. That particular Montana transition where winter refused to die but couldn't quite hold on. Eli sat in the courtroom with Margaret Chen, reinstated after investigation cleared her of criminal wrongdoing, though her career would never fully recover. Across the room, Graves sat with Torres and a new caseworker assigned specifically to oversee unusual placements. The judge reviewed the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who understood this case would be scrutinized for years. "This is highly irregular," she said finally, placing a minor with the motorcycle club member who was recently on trial for murder. "Your Honor," Torres stood. "Mr. Graves was acquitted, and the psychological evaluations show he provides stability and protection that Eli hasn't found in traditional placements. He lives in a garage. He lives in a community with people who've demonstrated willingness to protect Eli at significant personal cost. And isn't that what we're looking for in permanent placements? People who put the child's welfare first?" The judge looked at Eli. "Young man, do you understand what you're agreeing to? This placement means living with bikers, means a lifestyle that's unconventional, means accepting that your guardian has a complicated past." "Yes, Your Honor." "And you still want this?" "They're my family," Eli said simply. "They chose me when nobody else would, so yeah, I want this." The judge studied him for a long moment, then she signed the paperwork. "Conditional placement, 6-month review. Any concerns, and we revisit immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Graves said. And just like that, it was over. Eli walked out of the courthouse with Graves, Torres handling final paperwork behind them. The winter sun was too bright, the air too cold, everything too normal for a moment that felt like rebirth. "You sure about this?" Graves asked as they crossed the parking lot. "Last chance to back out." "I'm sure. It's not going to be easy. I've got PTSD, nightmares, days when I can't function. You'll have to learn to handle that." You've got trauma. I've got trauma. We'll figure it out together. Graves stopped beside his motorcycle, the same bike Eli remembered from that first day in the clubhouse parking lot. You know I'm not your father, right? Can't replace what you lost. I know, but you're something, and something's better than nothing. Yeah, Graves agreed. It is. They rode back to the clubhouse through melting snow and mud and the particular ugliness of Montana spring. The building was almost finished, new walls, new roof, the garage operational again. Mac was working on a Harley when they pulled up, his nicotine-stained fingers steady on the carburetor. Tina was inside restocking the bar. Cole and Reaper were playing cards at the wooden table that had somehow survived the fire. It looked like home, smelled like motor oil and coffee and cigarette smoke, sounded like low voices and classic rock on the radio and the particular rhythm of men who'd learned to exist together in the margins. Eli's room was in back. The storage room converted properly this time, with actual furniture, a real bed, walls painted something other than concrete gray. His drawings of motorcycles were taped to one wall. A toolbox from Mac sat on the desk. A leather jacket, child-sized, club-cut, with his name stitched on the front, hung on the closet door. When did you... Eli started. While you were in testimony, Graves said from the doorway. Figured if this placement went through, you'd need to look the part. Eli crossed to the jacket and touched the leather. Worn soft, probably from someone's old cut, altered to fit a 12-year-old. On the back, above the club insignia, someone had added a small patch. Protected. Not a member. Not a biker. But claimed. Watched over. Part of the family, even if he didn't ride. It's perfect, Eli said, his voice thick. That night they gathered around the wooden table. All of them. The entire remaining club. Tina brought food from the diner. Mac opened beers and poured Eli a Coke in a bottle that looked identical. They ate and talked and told stories about the fire and the trials and the months in custody that none of them wanted to remember but couldn't quite forget. To survival, Graves said finally, raising his beer. To family, Mac added. To the kid who saved us, Cole said, nodding at Eli. I didn't save you, Eli protested. Yeah, you did, Reaper said. You went on television, made it impossible to bury the story, gave us context that made the jury see us as protectors instead of criminals. You absolutely saved us. They drank to that. Eli sipped his Coke and felt something settle in his chest. Not healing exactly, because healing took time and probably therapy and definitely years, but something like peace, like the possibility that life after trauma could include moments of genuine safety. Later, after the others had gone home or crashed in back rooms, Eli sat on the clubhouse steps with Graves. The March night was cold but not brutal. Stars visible through breaking clouds. Somewhere distant, a train whistled through the darkness. You ever regret it? Eli asked. Taking me in that first day? Graves lit a cigarette and exhaled smoke toward the stars. Every day. And never. It's complicated. Yeah, You changed everything, you know. The club, me. Made us remember we could be something other than broken men drowning in our own damage. He flicked ash into the gravel. But it also cost us. The clubhouse burned. We went on trial, lost months to custody. Some members left because the heat got too intense. I'm sorry. Shish, don't. I'm not saying it to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it to make you understand that sometimes the right choice costs everything. And you do it anyway. Because some things are worth the price. Like what? Graves looked at him, the sergeant-at-arms with ice-cold eyes and old war trauma, who'd somehow become the closest thing to a father Eli would ever have. Like you. Like protecting someone who needed it. Like proving that men like us can be more than our worst moments. They sat in silence while the train whistle faded and the stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere in the darkness, Montana continued its slow transition from winter to spring. Eli thought about his mother, Rachel Mercer, who died trying to get him back. About Wade and the darkness he'd carried. About systems that failed and people who stepped up when systems wouldn't. And about the strange, impossible family he'd found in a biker clubhouse filled with wounded men who'd learned to protect because nobody had protected them. I'm going to make something of myself, Eli said finally. Go to college. Build a life. Make your protection worth it. You already have, Graves said. You survived. That's enough. But Eli shook his head. No, Surviving is just the beginning. Now I have to figure out what comes after. This. Graves smiled, that cold, dark smile that Eli had learned meant approval. Yeah, you do. But you've got time, and you've got people watching your back. That's more than most people get. More than I ever thought I'd have. Yeah, me too. They stayed on those steps until the cold drove them inside, until exhaustion made sleep possible, until the night gave way to early dawn and the promise of something that might not be easy, but could be good if they worked for it. Inside, the clubhouse was quiet. Mac had crashed on the couch. Tina had left coffee ready for morning. The space heaters ticked their mechanical rhythm. And in the back room that was now officially Eli's, the leather jacket with protected stitched across the back hung, waiting for a future that suddenly felt possible. Eli pulled on that jacket and looked at himself in the mirror. He was still 12, still damaged, still carrying trauma that would take years to process. But he was also alive, protected, part of something that had been built from wreckage and determination and the particular loyalty of men who understood that family wasn't about blood. It was about choosing each other, over and over, even when it cost everything, especially then. Outside, the first light of spring touched the Montana landscape. The clubhouse stood against it, rebuilt, scarred, imperfect, but standing. Inside, damaged people slept the sleep of those who'd fought and survived and found something like peace in the aftermath. And in a back room that smelled like motor oil and new paint, a 12-year-old boy who'd been beaten, terrorized, and nearly killed finally felt safe enough to believe in tomorrow. Because sometimes the monsters lose. Sometimes the system works. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most broken people are exactly the ones who know how to protect what needs protecting. Graves appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand, looking almost peaceful in the early light. "You good?" "Yeah," Eli said, meaning it completely. "I'm good." "Then let's get breakfast. Long day ahead." They walked together through the clubhouse, past the wooden table scarred with history, past the garage where Mac's tools waited, past the wall covered in photographs of rides and brothers and moments that proved life after trauma was possible if you fought for it. And somewhere in heaven or the void or whatever came after, Rachel Mercer watched her son walk into morning with dangerous men who'd learned to be gentle, broken veterans who'd learned to heal, outlaw guardians who'd learned that protecting children was the most honorable fight of all. The story that started with a beaten kid asking for work had become something else entirely. A story about family forged in fire, about men learning they could be more than their damage, about a system failing and people stepping up anyway, about the particular love that existed in the margins where respectable society stopped looking, and about a boy who survived the unsurvivable and found home in the last place anyone would expect, inside. A biker clubhouse filled with wounded men who finally learned how to save themselves by saving him first. The sun rose over Montana. The Harleys sat quiet in the parking lot, waiting for their next ride. And inside the Black Vulture's MC clubhouse, breakfast smells mixed with coffee and the sound of family moving through morning routines. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what anyone would call normal, but it was theirs. And after everything they'd survived to get here, that was more than enough. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. Sometimes family chooses you instead of the other way around. And sometimes the people society calls dangerous are the only ones brave enough to stand between a child and the darkness. This is a story about those people, about the Black Vulture's MC, about Eli Mercer, and about the truth that protection doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears leather, rides a Harley, and asks for nothing except the chance to prove that even broken men can build something worth saving.